Welcome, everyone. As the night settles in, let's drift together into the pages of time, unfolding another story from the past. Maybe you're already lying in bed, or simply letting history keep you company before sleep. Where are you listening from tonight? I'd love to know the place and hour of yours these words reach you. And if these gentle tales of lives long ago bring you comfort and rest, I'd be honored to have you stay with me by subscribing to this channel. So, here's the story. The Morrigan, a chronicle of shadow and sovereignty. The unmaking of silence. Before the first oak raised its head to the sun, before the first stone was laid upon the green hills of Ire, there was the unformed. It was not a void, but a potent, seething chaos of potential, a symphony of raw elements waiting for a conductor. Here, in the roiling, mist-choked chasm of nothingness and everything, a spark of consciousness flickered. It was not born of love or light, us in the songs of other lands, but of necessity. It was the awareness of conflict, the first principle of struggle that would one day define life itself. This spark was the nascent spirit of the being, who would be called the Morrigan. In the beginning, she was not a woman, nor a crow, nor a goddess. She was a concept, given sentience, the inevitable clash of spear on shield, the fierce protection of territory, the terrifying and beautiful truth of transformation through violence. For eons that had no measure, she drifted in the formless murk, a silent witness to the birthing of stars and the slow, grinding dance of continents. She felt the pull of the future land that would be Ireland, a small, defiant jewel of emerald green and storm-gray rock, already singing a song of battle and blood in its very bones. The first sound she ever made was not a cry, but a hum, a low, resonant frequency that vibrated through the primordial sludge. It was the hum of a whetstone on a blade yet to be forged. This hum grew, gathering the disparate energies of fate and fury, drawing them into her core. The chaos around her began to respond, to coalesce. Shadows, deep and velvety as a raven's wing, peeled away from the greater dark, swirling around her nascent form. They were not mere absences of light, but substances in themselves, woven from forgotten oaths and promises of future vengeance. Then came the pain of becoming. It was an agony of creation, a tearing and a knitting together. Us she forced the concept of herself into a shape that the world to come could comprehend. She did not choose the form of a woman lightly. It was a vessel of immense power, life-giver and life-taker, a vessel capable of holding profound love and terrible wrath. Her body manifested not from clay or dust, but from the dark, rich soil of a battlefield after the rain, from the gnarled roots of the sacred hawthorn, and from the shimmering, iridescent blackness of a crow's feather. She opened her eyes for the first time. They were not eyes of a single color, but pools of shifting, liquid obsidian that reflected no light, but rather seemed to absorb the very essence of the unformed around her. She looked down at her hands, pale, long-fingered, and strong, capable of both a caress and a killing blow. She was tall and formidable, her hair a cascade of living shadow that moved as if in a wind that did not exist. She stood, fully formed, upon a plain of her own making, a stark, gray landscape under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The silence was now broken. It had been unmade by her presence. And in its place was a new sound, the sound of her own breath, a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the thunder of her own heart. She was alone, but she was complete. She was the promise of war, the whisper of fate,
the sovereignty of the land given flesh. She was Anan, she was Badb, she was Macha, she was the Morrigan. And the world, though it did not yet know it, had just gained its most terrifying and necessary guardian. The first step she took did not echo, for there was nothing for it to echo against, but it sent a ripple through the fabric of possibility, a tremor that would, in time, be felt in the halls of the first gods and in the dreams of the first kings. Her journey had begun not with a destination, but with a purpose. She was to be the crucible in which the metal of heroes and gods would be tested, the loom upon which the fates of mortals and immortals would be woven. And us she stood in her self-wrought dominion, a single spectral crow cawed in the distance, a sound that was both a greeting and a warning, the first note in a symphony of strife that would echo for millennia. The sigh of the land. The transition from the unformed to the world of substance was not a step, but a dissolution and a reweaving.
The gray plains of her nascence shimmered, their insubstantial fabric tearing like rotten linen. For a heartbeat, the Morrigan was formless once more, a consciousness spread thin across the threshold of being. Then the world rushed in. It was an assault of sensation. The first was smell, the rich, peaty scent of damp earth, the sharp tang of crushed bog myrtle, the cold, clean breath of a wind sweeping in from a steel-gray sea. Then came sound, the whisper of long grass against her newly formed legs, the distant, rhythmic crash of waves on a rocky shore, the lonely cry of a curlew echoing over the moors. Finally, sight resolved. She stood on a headland of emerald green, cloaked in a fine, clinging mist that beaded on her skin like cold sweat. Below her, the land unfolded in a tapestry of breathtaking, brutal beauty. It was a land of stark contrasts, gentle rolling hills giving way to jagged, bone-white cliffs, serene glassy lochs reflecting a sky pregnant with storm clouds, dark, ancient forests that seemed to swallow the light. This was Aire, and it was singing. The song was not one heard with ears, but felt in the marrow of her bones, a low, resonant hum that was the land's own life force. It was a song of growth and decay, of peace shattered by conflict, of kings crowned and kings betrayed. It was a symphony, and she realized with a jolt that her own heart now beat in time with its most violent, passionate movements. She was not merely in the land, she was of it. Her feet, bare on the wet grass, seemed to draw strength from the soil, feeling the slow, patient thoughts of the stone beneath, the quick, vibrant energy of the roots and streams. She began to walk, her movements fluid and purposeful. The long, coarse grass, tipped with droplets of water, brushed against her calves. The mist clung to her hair, making the dark strands glisten. She was a figure of shadow and mist, a new power in an old world. As she moved inland, the landscape shifted. She entered a forest of oak and yew, their trunks thick and gnarled with age, their branches forming a canopy that turned the day to twilight. The air grew still and heavy with the scent of loam and decay. Here, the land song was different, older, darker, full of secrets and the memory of blood spilled in forgotten clearings. It was in this ancient wood that she encountered her first living thing of significance. It was not a god, nor a man, but a wolf. A great gray beast, its fur matted with the damp, its eyes like chips of yellow amber. It stood at the edge of a clearing, watching her, its body tense, a low growl rumbling in its chest. It was hunger and territory given form. The Morrigan did not stop. She did not slow her pace. She met its gaze, and in her obsidian eyes, the wolf did not see prey, nor a rival. It's sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the essence of the hunt itself, the sacred violence that governed its existence. The growl died in its throat. It lowered its head, not in submission, but in recognition, then turned and melted back into the shadows of the trees. She had passed her first test, not by force, but by identity. Deeper she went, until she found a clearing dominated by a single, massive hawthorn tree, its branches twisted and claw-like, its trunk split and hollowed by time. This was a place of power. She could feel it thrumming in the air, a static charge that raised the fine hairs on her arms. In the center of the clearing, a pool of black water, so still it looked like a sheet of polished jet, reflected the brooding sky. This was a well of seeing. Driven by an instinct she did not yet fully understand, the Morrigan knelt at the water's edge. Her own reflection stared back, a pale, severe face, eyes of shifting darkness, hair like a storm cloud. But as she gazed, the image changed. The water swirled, not with mud, but with shadows and light. Visions flickered across its surface. She saw towering figures of light and beauty, the Tuatha De Danann arriving in a mist, their ships like clouds. She saw a great battle against a monstrous, one-armed, one-legged giant, the Fir Bolg. She saw a king with a silver arm, and a king who was an oak tree. And she saw herself standing amidst the carnage, sometimes as a woman, sometimes as a crow, sometimes as a great she-wolf, her voice a thunderous incantation that swayed the fates of warriors. She saw a man, large and powerful, with a great club that could kill 9 men with one end and resurrect them with the other. He was laughing, his face ruddy and strong, but his eyes held a deep, ancient sorrow, the Dagda. A complex, unsettling feeling stirred within her, a pull of recognition, of a destiny intertwined. But then the visions darkened. She, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a later battle, a desperate fight against a horde of fire-haired warriors, the Fomorians. She, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the land itself weeping, its green fields scorched and blackened. And she, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a single, radiant hero, a young man with a terrible, beautiful light in his eyes, fighting a doomed, glorious stand. His fate was a tangled, bloody thread, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that her own hands would be the ones to weave it. The water stilled. Her reflection returned. She rose, her mind reeling from the torrent of prophecy. She was no longer just a concept given form. She was a player in a story already being written. The land had sighed its secrets to her. She now knew her purpose. She was to be the guardian of its sovereignty, the weaver of its fate in war, the prophet of its triumphs and tragedies. The peace of the misty headland was gone, replaced by the grim resolve of one who has seen the blood that must be shed. Turning from the well, she walked back into the forest, her path now clear. She would find the Tuatha De Danann. She would take her place among them. The phantom queen had arrived, and her shadow would now fall across the destiny of a nation. The Court of the Ever-Young. The journey from the ancient forest to the heartland of the Tuatha De Danann was a passage through a world waking to myth. The Morrigan moved like a wisp of storm cloud, her passage noted only by the beasts and the spirits of the land. Foxes paused in their hunting to watch her pass. Ravens circled high above, their caws sounding like acknowledgments. She crossed rushing salmon-filled rivers and wide rolling plains where the standing stones of forgotten peoples stood as silent sentinels. The land's song was her guide, its melody pulling her ever eastward, towards a concentration of power that shone in her senses like a beacon. Finally, she crested a ridge and looked down upon the Brugh na Boina, the great necropolis and stronghold of the gods. It was not a city of spires and walls, but a landscape sculpted by divine hands. Great mounds, like sleeping giants, rose from the earth, their entrances hidden by art and sorcery. The river Boyne coiled around them, a silver ribbon glinting in the fitful sunlight. The air here was thick with magic, a palpable hum that set her teeth on edge. It was the sound of laughter, of poetry, of smithcraft, and of potent hidden knowledge. This was the court of the ever-young, the people of the goddess Danu. She did not announce her arrival with a fanfare. She simply walked into their midst, emerging from the tree line near the great central mound us silently as the dusk. The scene before her was one of vibrant, chaotic life. Beautiful, immortal beings were gathered in groups. Some practice with weapons of bright bronze and silver, their movements a deadly, graceful dance. Others played complex melodies on harps of gold and willow, the notes seeming to make the very air shimmer. A group around a fire listened, enraptured, us handsome, sharp-eyed god, whom she would later know as Ogma, recited a poem that wove the history of the stars into its verses. Her entrance did not go unnoticed. The music faltered. The sparring ceased. All eyes turned to the tall, stark figure standing at the edge of their revelry. She was a discordant note in their symphony of light. Where they were golden and bright, she was pale and dark. Where their beauty was open and inviting, hers was severe and intimidating, a beauty of sharp edges and deep shadows. The air grew cold. A god stepped forward, his armor gleaming, a spear of light in his hand. He was Luch Lamfada, of the long arm, his face a mask of youthful brilliance and suspicion. "Who comes to the Brugh na Boina?" His voice rang out, clear and commanding. "You are not of our people. Name yourself." The Morrigan met his gaze, and even the great Luch felt a chill. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried to every ear, low and resonant, like the hum of a taut bowstring. "I am of this land, as you are. I am the cry of the crow over the field of contest. I am the fury that guards the sacred stone. I am the prophecy in the water of the well. I am the Morrigan." A murmur rippled through the assembly. This was no minor spirit, no simple creature of the wild. This was a power, a sovereignty. It was then that another figure emerged from the great mound. He was a massive man, broad-shouldered and powerful, with a great brown beard and kind, weary eyes. He wore a simple tunic of rough cloth, but his presence dwarfed even the resplendent Luch. This was the Dagda, the good god, the father of the tribe. He carried no weapon, but in his hand was a great wooden club, so large it would have taken 2 mortal men to lift it. He looked at the Morrigan, and his gaze was not one of suspicion, but of deep, profound understanding. He, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, not an intruder, but a completion. He had felt the land sigh, had sensed the shifting of the cosmic scales. He walked towards her, the other gods parting before him like reeds before a gentle bull. "Welcome, Morrigan," he said, his voice a warm, deep rumble, using the ancient form of her name. "We have felt the stirring. The land has birthed its queen of phantoms. Your seat at our fire has been empty, waiting." He gestured to a large flat stone near the central fire, a place of honor. Lug looked as if he would protest, but a sharp glance from the Dagda silenced him. The Morrigan, her obsidian eyes fixed on the Dagda, accepted the invitation. As she moved to sit, the atmosphere in the brug shifted. The revelry did not resume its former carefree tone. A new, sharper element had been introduced. The reality of their purpose, their impending war with the Fomorians, the dark, chaotic oppressors from the sea, was now personified in this formidable goddess. She was a living reminder that their idyllic existence was fragile, that the shadow of war was long, and that its goddess had now come to claim her due. She sat, straight-backed and silent, watching the court of the ever-young. She did not smile. She did not partake of their food or drink. She simply observed, learning their strengths, their weaknesses, their alliances, and their pride. She had found her people, but she was not one of them. She was their destiny, and destiny, she knew, was rarely kind. The first prophecy. The days that followed her arrival at the Bruch na Boina were a study in divine tension. The Morrigan became a fixed, shadowy point in the glittering constellation of the Tuatha De Danann. She did not seek companionship, nor did she offer any. She resided not within the warm, earthy confines of the great mound, but preferred the open air, often standing sentinel on the highest point of the rampart, her form a stark silhouette against the moonlit sky. The lesser gods and goddesses gave her a wide berth, their laughter stifling as they passed her, their eyes darting away from her penetrating gaze. They called her a nun in whispers, the name itself a sound of unease. Yet the Dagda sought her out. He would often find her at dusk, bringing with him a wooden cup of deep red ale and a loaf of coarse barley bread. He did not press her with questions or empty courtesies. He would simply sit nearby, his massive frame settled onto the grass with a sigh that spoke of the weight of kingship, and he would wait. It was during one of these quiet vigils, the sun bled into the western sea and the stars began to prick the velvet sky, that she finally spoke to him of what she had seen. "The Fomorians gather," she said, her voice cutting through the twilight hush. It was not a guess, it was a statement of immutable fact. The Dagda did not startle. He took a slow draught of his ale, his eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. "We have heard whispers from the coastal tribes. Their ships, like a forest of dead trees, have been seen on the foggy edges of the world. They are led by Balor of the poisonous eye." "The eye that has not yet opened," the Morrigan replied, her tone flat. "But it will. He seeks to lay his cold, dead hand upon the throat of this land, to squeeze its song into a silent gurgle." She turned her head, and in the failing light, her eyes seemed to swallow the last vestiges of the sun. "You plan to meet them on the plain, the great flatness by the eastern sea, Mag Tuirid." The Dagda nodded, his face grim. "It is the only place large enough for such a host. It is there we will break them, or be broken." A slow, mirthless smile touched the Morrigan's lips. It was a terrifying sight, a crack in the ice of her composure. You will not break them with bronze alone, Eochaid Olathair. She used his true name, the name that meant Horse Lord, Great Father, and the sound of it on her tongue was both a recognition and a challenge. She rose to her feet, a tall, slender column of gathering night. "Call them," she commanded, her voice gaining a resonant, metallic quality. "Call all your chieftains, your smith, your physician, your champion, your wizard. Call them to the council stone. The land has a voice, and it will speak through me tonight." The summons went out, carried on the swift feet of lesser spirits. Soon, the great ones of the Tuatha De Danann were assembled around the large, flat dolmen capstone that served as their council table. Lug was there, his face a mask of controlled impatience. Goibne the smith, his arms still smudged with the soot of his forge, stood solid and dependable. Dion Kecht the healer, with his bag of herbs and potions, looked on with professional curiosity. And Ogma the champion, whose strength was matched only by his eloquence, watched the Morriga with a wary respect. The Dagda stood at the head of the stone. The Morrigan comes with a word from the land itself. Listen. All eyes turned to her. She did not stand among them, but slightly apart, on a small, natural rise, so that she looked down upon the gathered might of the gods. The wind picked up, whipping her hair about her face like a nest of dark serpents. She raised her arms, and the very air seemed to thicken, to grow heavy with portent. The playful starlight seemed to dim, and the world hushed. "I have drunk from the well of seeing," she began, her voice no longer her own. It was a chorus of voices, the shriek of the crow, the howl of the wolf, the sigh of the dying warrior, the groan of the earth under tramping feet. She fixed her gaze on Lugh. "You, Shining One, will face the Storm King. Your spear will be true, but his eye will open. It is a thing of cosmic pestilence, a blight that can wither 100 warriors where they stand. Do not look upon it, or your light will be extinguished forever." Her eyes swept to Goibniu. "Your blades will be sharp, smith. Your ale will grant immortality. But the Fomorian hammers will break more than bone. They will break the spirit. You must forge not just weapons, but resolve. To Dion Checht, your healing waters will revive the slain, but the wounds Balor's gaze inflicts are not of the flesh alone. They are a rot of the soul. For those, you have no cure." Finally, her gaze settled on the Dagda, and her voice softened, becoming almost intimate, yet no less terrible. "You, good God, will perform the great rite. You will mate with the land itself, embodied in its darkest aspect. You will come to me on the eve of the battle at the river ford. And from our union the victory will be conceived. But the cost will be a piece of your own vitality, a scar upon your boundless strength. This is the price of sovereignty." A stunned silence fell upon the council. Her prophecy was not a simple prediction of victory or defeat. It was a complex, bloody tapestry of sacrifice, horror, and fragile hope. Lugh was the first to break the silence, his pride stung. "You speak of defeat and rot? We are the Tuatha De Danann. We brought the 4 great treasures to this land. We will sweep these Fomorian wretches back into the sea." The Morrigan's head tilted, a gesture eerily reminiscent of a bird of prey. Your light is bright, Luch Lamfada, but even the sun is consumed by the night. Do not let your light blind you to the shadows. Victory is not a gift. It is a child born of blood and prophecy, and it must be midwifed by terror. She lowered her arms. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and the starlight seemed to brighten once more. The course is set. The threads are in my hands. Prepare for war, children of Danu. But know this, it is I, the Phantom Queen, who will decide upon which side the scales of fate shall fall. She stepped down from the rise and walked away, leaving the assembled gods in a silence more profound than any noise. For the first time, they understood the true nature of the power that had come among them. She was not a mere warrior or a seer. She was the terrible, necessary heart of the battle to come. The path to Mag Tuired was now clear, and it was drenched in shadow. The Right at the Ford. The eve of the first battle of Mag Tuired settled over the land like a shroud. A cold, damp wind blew in from the sea, carrying with it the salt tang of the coming storm and the faint, foul odor of the distant Fomorian host. The festive atmosphere of the Brug was gone, replaced by a grim, purposeful silence. Swords were given a final sharpening by Goibinhu's apprentices. Spearheads were fitted to ashwood shafts. The low murmur of prayers to the land and its spirits hummed through the encampment. The Morrigan was absent from these preparations. She had withdrawn to a place she had scouted days before, a shallow ford on the river Unshin, a place where the water chattered over smooth gray stones and the willow trees wept their long green hair into the current. It was a liminal space, neither one bank nor the other. A place of transition, perfectly suited for the sacred, terrible rite that was to come. She stood in the center of the ford, the cold water swirling around her ankles, her dark robes clinging to her legs. The moon, a pale gibbous sliver, played hide-and-seek with ragged clouds, casting a fitful, uncertain light. She was the still point in the turning world, a conduit waiting for the power to flow. She did not wait long. The Dagda came to her as promised. He walked into the river, his great bulk displacing the water with a soft, rushing sound. He had left his club and his armor behind. He wore only a simple, knee-length tunic, and his face, usually so full of robust good humor, was etched with a solemn gravity. He understood the weight of this ritual better than any other. He was to unite with the very spirit of the land in its most fearsome aspect, to ensure its protection and fertility. They did not speak. Words were useless here, mere scratches on the surface of a deep, primal magic. He stood before her, and she looked up at him, her obsidian eyes reflecting the fractured moonlight. She was the land, wild, demanding, and dangerous. He was its king and its consort, powerful, life-giving, but subject to its will. He reached for her, his large, work-roughened hands closing around her upper arms. His touch was not one of passion, but of purpose, a grounding, physical connection. Her own hands, cool and strong, came to rest on his broad chest, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart, the heart that sustained the tribe. The rite was not a gentle union. It was a fierce, desperate coupling, a channeling of immense, chaotic energies. They came together there in the cold water, the very elements responded. The wind, which had been a low moan, rose to a shriek, tearing at the willow branches. The river, once chattering, seemed to roar, its waters churning and rising to their thighs. The moon vanished completely, plunging the ford into an abyssal darkness, broken only by the occasional frantic flash of heat lightning that illuminated their joined forms in stark, silver relief. The Morrigan's head was thrown back, her lips parted, but no sound of pleasure escaped them. Instead, a torrent of words, guttural and ancient, poured forth. It was the incantation of war, the song of sovereignty. She named the strengths of the Tuatha Dé Danann and the weaknesses of the Fomorians. She wove the fate of the coming battle, binding it to their act. She prophesied the fall of kings and the rise of heroes. She was the loom, the shuttle, and the thread. The Dagda, for his part, endured. He was the anchor, the stable rock in this maelstrom of prophecy. He poured his own vast vitality into her, into the land she embodied. He felt a part of his own boundless strength, his seemingly infinite life force, being drawn out of him and into the swirling, dark energy that surrounded them. It was the sacrifice she had foretold, a king giving of his essence to ensure the land's survival. Suddenly it began. It was over. The wind died down to a whisper. The river subsided, its roar fading back to a murmur. The moon emerged from behind the clouds, casting a calm, silvery light upon the scene. The Morrigan and the Dagda stood apart, chests heaving, the ritual energy dissipating into the night air. A profound exhaustion clung to them both, but particularly to the Dagda, who looked older, as if the weight of the coming day had settled permanently upon his shoulders. The Morrigan looked at him, and for a fleeting moment, something akin to respect, or perhaps pity, flickered in the depths of her dark eyes. "It is done," she said, her voice hoarse. "The land is fortified, the victory is seeded, but the harvest will be bloody." The Dagda nodded, unable to speak. He turned and waded back to the riverbank, his steps heavier than when he had arrived. The Morrigan remained in the ford for a long time after he had gone, watching the water carry away the last echoes of their power. She had taken her first direct, tangible action in the affairs of the gods. She had mated with the king and bound the fate of the battle to her will. As the first hint of dawn tinged the eastern sky with the color of bruised flesh, she smiled. The stage was set, the players were ready, and she, the Phantom Queen, was prepared to take her place at the center of the carnage. The Crimson Feast of Mag Tuired. Dawn did not break over Mag Tuired, it bled. A sullen red sun shouldered its way above the horizon, staining the low-lying mist that clung to the great plain in hues of watered gore. The air was cold and still, heavy with the promise of iron and agony. Two armies faced each other across the dew-slicked grass, a sea of shifting shadows and glinting metal. On one side, the Tuatha Dé Danann stood in ordered companies, their banners, a silver hand for Luch, a stylized cauldron for the Dagda, a fiery sword for Ogma, hanging limp in the breathless air. Their faces were set, their hearts fortified by the knowledge of Goibniu's ale and Dian Kecht's arts, but a cold knot of dread tightened in every gut as they looked upon their foe. The Fomorian host was a nightmare given form. They were a grotesque tapestry of mismatched limbs and malformed bodies. Some had the heads of goats and the torsos of men. Others had single massive arms that dragged along the ground, ending in claws of blackened bone. Some had one leg, hopping with a terrifying, jerky agility. They were a race of chaos and despair, and at their center, raised high on a litter of human bones, sat Balor.
The king of the Fomorians was a giant of ancient petrified flesh, his face a web of deep fissures, and in the center of his forehead a great lidded eye was sealed shut, its lid crusted and vile, pulsing with a sickly internal light. The mere sight of him was a poison that seeped into the soul. The Morrigan watched from the high ground, a rocky outcrop that gave her a panoramic view of the field. She was not part of the Tooth-a-Day's battle line. She was a force of nature, as impartial and terrible as the storm. She had shed her human form. Now she was a swirl of dark energy, a coalescence of shadow and intent. From this form she could fracture herself, become manifold, a chorus of doom. The first movement came not from the armies, but from her. A part of her essence detached, taking to the air with a rustle of spectral feathers.
A great crow, larger than any natural bird, its plumage the color of a starless midnight, circled high above the Fomorian ranks. It was the Badb, the battle crow. It let out a single piercing shriek that cut through the tense silence, a sound that was pure, undiluted fury. It was the scream of the land itself, violated and enraged. Goose, if this were the signal, the world erupted. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the earth, the two hosts crashed together. The sound was a hellish cacophony, the shriek of bronze on iron, the wet thud of weapons finding homes in flesh, the bellows of rage, and the screams of the dying. The ordered lines of the Two-a-Day dissolved into 1,000 individual struggles for survival. Ogma, a whirlwind of destruction, carved a path through the Fomorian ranks, his sword a blur of silver light, leaving a trail of dismembered monstrosities in his wake. The Dagda, his great club swinging in wide, devastating arcs, shattered limbs and skulls, each blow landing with the finality of a landslide. But the Fomorians were numberless. For every one that fell, 2 more seemed to claw their way up from the bloody mire. They fought with a feral, desperate strength, their strange forms making their attacks unpredictable and horrifying. The Morrigan moved through the chaos. She was the Maka now, a frenzied presence flickering at the edges of vision. To a Two-a-Day warrior whose courage was faltering, she would appear as a beautiful, terrifying woman, her eyes blazing, screaming a challenge that reignited the fire in his heart. Fight for the land, for your king! To a Fomorian who had just struck down a divine warrior, she would appear as a snarling she-wolf, launching herself at his throat, her fangs sinking deep, not just into flesh, but into his very life force, draining his strength and feeding it back into the waning power of the Two-a-Day. She was a goddess of many aspects, and she wielded them all as weapons. She was the fury that empowered her chosen. She was the terror that broke her enemies. She was the prophecy unfolding in real time. The battle raged for hours. The sun climbed higher, its light doing little to illuminate the scene, seeming only to make the blood look black and the shadows deeper. The Dagda's movements were slowing, the sacrifice at the ford taking its toll. Ogma was bleeding from a dozen wounds. The Two-a-Day line was being pressed back, step, bloody step. It was then that Balor stirred on his gruesome litter. He raised a gnarled hand, and his Fomorian guards began to crank a terrible mechanism. A groan of ancient protesting metal echoed across the plain. The lid over his great eye began to slowly, agonizingly rise. A wave of pure psychic dread preceded the opening of the eye. Warriors on both sides faltered, a primal fear freezing their limbs. A sliver of baleful greenish light leaked from the opening fissure. Where that light touched, the very air curdled. A Tuatha-Dé warrior who was caught in the edge of the beam did not simply die. His flesh sloughed from his bones, his armor rusted to dust in seconds, and his spirit was torn screaming from its moorings, utterly unmade. Lug saw atis his moment. He hefted his spear, the Lewin of Kelchar, a weapon that thirsted for blood and had to be kept point down in a vat of poppy juice to keep it calm. He began to run, not towards Balor, but along a path that kept him just outside the creeping edge of the deadly light. The Morrigan saw atis it all. She coalesced directly in Lug's path for a heartbeat, a solid form of shadow and screaming wind. Now, son of Kian, now or never. Her voice was a whip-crack of fate. Lug did not break stride. He put all his strength, all his divine light into one cast. The Lewin flew, a streak of incandescent fury. It was not aimed at Balor's heart or his head. It was aimed for the opening eye. The timing was perfect. As the lid rolled fully back, revealing the full, horrifying, pustulant orb of cosmic destruction, the spear found its mark. It struck the open eye with a sound like a mountain splitting in two. Balor's scream was not a sound of pain, but of reality tearing. The poisonous energy of his eye, with no outlet, reversed its flow. The green light turned inwards, consuming him. His massive form swelled, blackened, and then exploded outwards in a cataclysm of black blood and fragmented bone. The shockwave blew Fomorians and Tuatha-Dé alike from their feet. In the stunned silence that followed the explosion, a single sound rang out. It was the triumphant, terrible shriek of the Bod, circling over the field. "Fa! Fa Abala!" it screamed. "Victory! Victory is ours!" The cry broke the Fomorian spirit. What was left of their army broke and fled, scrambling towards the sea in a mindless rout. The Battle of Mag Tyrid was won. The Morrigan stood once more on her outcrop, whole again. She looked down upon the field. It was a charnel house, a landscape of the dead and the dying. The river that bordered the plain ran red. The cost had been immense, just as she had foretold, but the land was safe. Its sovereignty, sealed by her right with the Dagda, was preserved. She felt no joy, no sorrow. Only a grim, profound satisfaction. The Crimson Feast was over. The land had been fed, and she, the Phantom Queen, had presided over the table. The scab upon the land. Victory at Mag Tyrid was a bitter, Ushan draught. There were no songs of triumph that night, only the low, pained moans of the wounded and the weary. Monotonous thud of digging us mass graves were carved from the unwilling earth. The air, once thick with the metallic tang of battle, now stank of opened bowels, clotted blood, and the sweet, cloying scent of death bloom that already crept over the fallen. The Tuatha-Dé Danann moved through the aftermath like ghosts, their divine light dimmed by exhaustion and horror. The euphoria of survival had been fleeting, replaced by the crushing weight of the cost. The Morrigan walked among them, a silent, observing wraith. The frenzied energy of the battle had left her, leaving behind a cold, clear-eyed focus. The war was over, but her work was not. A battlefield was a wound upon the body of the land, and if left to fester, it could breed a pestilence far worse than any Fomorian horde. The sheer volume of spilled blood, the concentrated anguish of thousands of souls torn violently from their shells, created a spiritual miasma that poisoned the soil and the streams.
It was a scab of suffering, and it was her duty to ensure it healed cleanly or to cauterize it if it would not. She went first to the field hospital Dion Checht had established near a freshwater spring. The healer and his children, Ahmed and Miach, moved with a frantic, grim efficiency. They washed wounds in the waters of the spring, which held a faint residual magic, and applied poultices of healing herbs. But for many, it was too late. The Morrigan paused by a young warrior whose belly had been torn open. His eyes, wide with shock, stared at the darkening sky, seeing nothing. She placed a cool hand on his forehead, and a faint shudder went through him. She did not close his eyes.
Instead, she leaned close and whispered a single word, a sibilant sound that was not a comfort but a command, a directive for the lost soul to find its way to the other world, to not linger as a vengeful shade and add to the field's corruption. The faint spark of his life force flickered and then streamed away, a wisp of silver smoke drawn into the twilight. Leaving the healers to their work, she walked the length and breadth of the carnage. Her bare feet, pale against the blood-soaked mud, did not flinch from the gore. With every step, she absorbed the residual pain, the anger, the fear. It was a toxic brew, but it was her element. She was the filter through which the land could process its trauma. She saw a group of Fomorian wounded, their monstrous forms twisted in agony, being dispatched by grim-faced Tuatha-Dé warriors. She did not intervene. This, too, was a form of cleansing. As the moon rose, full and cold, she came to the center of the field, near the scorched and blackened crater where Balor had met his end. The ground here was dead, the very soil blighted by the backwash of his poisonous power. Nothing would ever grow here again. She knelt, plunging her hands deep into the ashen, cursed earth. A jolt of pure malevolence shot up her arms, a memory of the eye's power that made her own divine essence recoil. She gritted her teeth, forcing her will into the soil. This was not an act of healing, but of quarantine. She could not purify this place, so she would seal it. She began to chant, a low, guttural rhythm that was the antithesis of life. She drew upon the shadows that gathered at the edges of the field, pulling them towards her, weaving them into a net of binding and forgetting. She laid this net of solidified shadow over the blighted ground, stitching its edges with threads of ancient power. To any mortal or god who later walked here, it would feel like a place of profound unease, a spot they would instinctively avoid. The land's memory of this ultimate violation was being buried, hidden beneath a shroud of divine will. Her final task was the most profound. She stood at the highest point of the plain and spread her arms. She called to the scavengers. From the darkening woods and the misty hills they came. First the crows, a great black cloud of them, their cause a raucous funeral dirge. They settled on the corpses, their sharp beaks performing the necessary grisly work of cleansing. Then the wolves, slinking from the tree line, their yellow eyes gleaming. They took the larger remains, dragging them away, consuming the physical evidence of the slaughter, returning flesh and bone to the cycle of nature. The Tuatha-Dé watched this from their campfires, a silent, awestruck, and slightly horrified audience. They saw the goddess who had fought with them now presiding over the carrion feast. They understood that she was not just a bringer of war, but its manager, its high priestess, and its mortician. She was ensuring that the land, their mother and their charge, could digest the horror it had been forced to consume. By the time the first hint of dawn grayed the sky, the atmosphere over Mag Tuerd had shifted. The palpable weight of anguish and vengeful spirits had lessened. The air, while still heavy with the smell of death, was no longer thick with active malice. The land was beginning to breathe again. Its song, though scarred and mournful, was once more its own. The Morrigan lowered her arms. She was weary to the very core of her being, saturated with the suffering she had absorbed. She turned her back on the plain and walked away, not towards the victorious camp, but into the wild, untamed hills. Her work was done. The scab had been formed. The healing could now begin. And she, the phantom queen, would retreat into the shadows to rest, and to wait for the next time the land would have need of her terrible, necessary grace. The Forge of Kings. The peace that settled over air after Mag Tuerd was not the soft, idle peace of a land without care. It was a hard-won, vigilant quiet, like the stillness in a smithy after a great blade has been quenched. The Tuatha De Danann, their numbers thinned, but their spirit tempered in the fires of war, set about the work of ruling. They were the gods now, unchallenged, and the land itself seemed to sigh with a measure of relief, its song a gentler melody of growth and order. But the Morrigan knew that order was a fragile construct, a dam against the ever-pressing chaos of the world. A kingdom without a true king was like a body without a head, a directionless, decaying thing. The Dagda, the good god, was a father to his people, a generous and powerful figure, but his was the strength of the hearth and the harvest. The sovereignty of the land, the mystical contract between the ruler and the soil, required a different kind of vessel, a mortal king, whose life and death would be bound to the health of the realm. The gods could guide, but it was the blood of man that must feed the roots of the oak of kingship. She watched from the edges of the great settlements, a rumor whispered by the wind. She saw Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the first mortal tribes, the Milesians, gaining in strength and number, their chants to the earth simpler, more desperate, more real than the sophisticated magics of the Tuatha De. Their lives were brief, bright sparks, and that very brevity gave their choices a weight that immortality could never possess. It was time to forge a king. She began her work not in a royal hall, but in the womb of a mortal queen. She appeared to the woman in a dream, a tall, shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. The Morrigan did not speak, but laid a single, cold finger upon the queen's sleeping brow. The woman stirred, a vision of a great red stallion with eyes of fire and a mane like flowing blood searing itself into her mind. When she awoke, she knew she carried a child of destiny. She named him Oahu Fidlech, Oahu of the long reign. The Morrigan monitored his growth from the shadows. She was the unseen pressure that shapes the diamond in the coal. When the boy, Oahu, was learning to hunt, it was she, in the form of a she-wolf, who drove a great stag towards his first clumsy spear cast, teaching him the connection between life, death, and sustenance. When he was learning kingship from his aging father, it was she, as a hooded crone by the roadside, who posed him riddles of justice and sacrifice, forcing his young mind to grapple with the terrible burdens of rule. The final test came when his father died, and the kingship of Connacht lay open. Rival chieftains, his uncles and cousins, gathered like vultures, their ambitions a poison in the water of the tribe. A great assembly, an Oenach, was called at the sacred site of Cruachan. It was a place of immense power, a cave mound that was a gateway to the other world. The air crackled with political tension and latent magic.
The Morrigan was there, of course. She stood at the edge of the great gathering, visible to all, a stark, silent figure of judgment. The rival chieftains made their speeches, boasting of their lineage, their wealth, their prowess in battle.
Their words were empty boasts, the clanging of cheap metal. Then Eohu stepped forward. He was young, but his eyes held a gravity that silenced the crowd. He spoke not of what he had, but of what he would give. He spoke of the land as a living entity, a mother to be served, not a possession to be owned. His words were simple, direct, and carried the weight of truth. As he spoke, the Morrigan moved. She did not walk, but seemed to flow across the grass, coming to stand directly before him. The crowd gasped and fell back. She was the embodiment of the land's judgment, the very sovereignty he sought to wed. "Who seeks to rule me?" Her voice was the rustle of dry leaves, the crackle of winter frost. "I do," Eohu replied, his voice steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "And what do you offer in return from my embrace?" she asked, her obsidian eyes boring into his soul. "Will you offer me wealth? I have the gold of the sun on the hills. Will you offer me strength? I have the strength of the mountains. Will you offer me your life?" Eohu did not hesitate. He knew this was the heart of the matter. "I offer you my service, my justice, my protection. And when my time is done, I offer you my body to return to your soil, so that my successor may be nourished by my decay, as I was nourished by my predecessors. The king is the servant of the land, not its master." A profound silence fell. It was the correct answer. The Morrigan's stern expression did not change, but she slowly, deliberately raised her hand. In it was a silver chalice, filled not with wine, but with dark, rich water from a sacred well. This was the Lia Fal, the stone of destiny in its liquid aspect, the test of true kingship. "Drink," she commanded. Eohu took the chalice. His hands did not tremble. He raised it to his lips and drank deeply. The water was cold, tasting of stone and deep earth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a low hum began to emanate from the very ground beneath their feet. The standing stones that ringed the assembly began to glow with a soft internal light. The land itself was acknowledging him. The Morrigan gave a single, sharp nod. "The land accepts your offering. You are its chosen. Rule well, Eohu Feidlek, for I am always watching." As she spoke, her form dissolved into a murder of crows that erupted into the sty, their cause a triumphant, terrifying coronation hymn. The assembled chieftains, their ambitions shattered by this divine intervention, could do nothing but kneel. Eoku Feidlek was king. The Morrigan watched from a high crag as the new king was acclaimed. She felt the land's song shift, attuning itself to the rhythm of this new, mortal heart. It was a stronger, more vibrant melody now. She had not placed a puppet on the throne. She had helped forge a true vessel for sovereignty. The king was made, the contract was sealed, and she, the keeper of that contract, had ensured that the rule of Ere would be one of strength and symbiosis, for a time, for she knew that all kings, like all seasons, must eventually pass. The whisper in the bull's ear. The reign of Ochu Feidlek was long and prosperous, just as his name foretold. The fields were golden with grain, the cattle grew fat on the rich grass, and the seasons turned in their reliable wheel. The Morrigan was a distant memory for most, a figure from a foundational myth. But for the king, she was a constant, silent presence in the back of his mind. The cold touch of the chalice on his lips, a reminder of the price of his crown. He ruled justly, he ruled strongly, and the land was content. But contentment is a fragile state, and the Morrigan knew that the greatest threats to a kingdom often bloom not from without, but from within, the secret gardens of the human heart. The seed of this particular ruin was Ochu's own daughter, Medb. She was a woman of breathtaking beauty, with hair like spun copper and eyes the color of a summer sky. But within her breast beat a heart of pure, unadulterated ambition. She was not content to be a princess. She desired a sovereignty that was entirely her own, unshadowed by any man, even her father. The Morrigan watched Medb's growth with a detached, clinical interest. Her manipulation of suitors, her voracious appetite for power that mirrored the goddess's own, but lacked its divine purpose. Medb's desire was personal, venal. It was a corruption of the sacred principle of sovereignty. The crisis began subtly. A drought struck the province of Connacht. The earth cracked, the rivers shrank to muddy trickles, and the cattle lowed in piteous hunger. The druids sacrificed, the bards sang pleas to the gods, but the skies remained a hard, brazen blue. The people began to whisper. Was the king's strength waning? Had the land withdrawn its favor? Ochu, feeling the first cold fingers of doubt, sought counsel in the old ways. He went alone to a sacred grove, a place of ancient oaks where the veil was thin, and he called out to the one who had crowned him. The Morrigan came to him not as a woman, but as a whisper on the parched wind, a voice that seemed to emanate from the dry, rustling leaves above. The land is not sick, Ochu Fedlech. It is offended. The balance is broken. How? The king cried out, his voice ragged with desperation. I have ruled with justice. I have made the proper sacrifices. The offense does not come from your actions, but from your blood, the whisper hissed.
There is a canker in the root of your line, an ambition that seeks to own the land, not serve it. It whispers in the ear of the great bull, poisoning its pride. Eochu knew at once, Medb, his beloved, treacherous daughter. He had seen the way she looked at his crown, not with respect, but with covetousness. He had heard her speak of rule as if it were a prize to be won, not a sacred trust to be earned. He returned to his fort at Cruachan a changed man. He confronted Medb in the great hall, his face as gray as ash. You must renounce your claim, he told her, his voice trembling not with age, but with a terrible certainty. You must swear an oath to the land that you will seek no sovereignty for yourself. Your desire is a poison in the well. Medb looked at her father, her beautiful face a mask of cold fury. I will renounce nothing, she spat. The sovereignty of Connacht is my birthright. I am more fit to rule than any of your sniveling sons. I will have a kingdom that is mine, or I will see this one burn to ash around you. Her words hung in the air, a verbal blasphemy. The very stones of the hall seemed to recoil. Eochu, heartbroken and enraged, had no choice. Then you are a blight upon this land, he declared, his voice cracking with the strain. I cast you out. You are exiled from Connacht, never return, upon pain of death. Medb left, her head held high, but her eyes burning with a promise of vengeance that could have scorched the earth. The Morrigan watched her go. The canker had been cut out, but it had not been destroyed. It had simply been transplanted, and it would grow elsewhere, in darker soil. Within a week of Med's exile, the rains came. They were a gentle, life-giving benediction, washing the dust from the leaves and filling the rivers once more. The land was healing. The immediate threat was past. But the Morrigan was not appeased. She stood on the ramparts of Cruachan, invisible to the celebrating people below. She had saved the kingdom from one poison, but she had unleashed another upon the world. Medb would not rest. Her wounded pride and vaulting ambition would fester and grow, and would one day demand a terrible price. The whisper in the bull's ear had been silenced for now, but the bull itself, the pride and power of Connacht, was now a target. The Morrigan knew, with a prophet's cold certainty, that the peace of Eochu's reign was over. The threads of a new, even more devastating conflict were now being spun.
And she would be there, at the center of the loom, when the time came to weave them. The smith's fire and the hero's forge. The seasons turned, and the memory of Med's exile faded into the background hum of legend. The Morrigan's attention, ever drifting on the currents of fate, was drawn northwards to the rugged, wind-scoured coast of the Mirthamney Plain. A new power was stirring there, not of a king, but of a weapon. A soul being hammered on the anvil of prophecy into a hero. His name would be Setanta, but the world would come to know him as Cuchulainn, the Hound of Culann. The Morrigan felt his coming long before his birth. It was a sharp, bright tension in the web of what was to be. A point of incandescent light that promised both glorious triumph and utter desolation. She watched, a spectral observer, as the divine and mortal worlds conspired to create him. She saw the mighty Lu of the Tuatha De Danann descend to lie with the mortal princess Dictine. She felt the surge of power as the child was conceived, a mingling of brilliant sunfire and passionate, fleeting mortal clay. When the boy, Setanta, was born, his cry was not that of a mewling infant, but the sharp, challenging call of a hawk. The Morrigan stood in the shadows of the royal fort at Dundelgan, unseen, as the druids examined him and proclaimed his destiny. He would be a great champion whose name would be remembered forever. But his life would be brilliant and short, a flash of lightning across a stormy sky. She monitored his childhood with a fascination that was almost maternal, though it was the fierce, predatory maternity of a she-wolf. She saw his preternatural strength, his ferocious temper, his unquenchable fire. When the 6-year-old boy, armed only with a hurley stick and a ball, defended himself against the full warrior band of King Concobar mac Nessa, the Morrigan was there. She did not manifest, but she fed the battle fury that rose in his small chest, a whisper of her own power that made his eyes glow with a terrifying otherworldly light. He fought not like a child, but like a force of nature, and he emerged victorious, his small body trembling with a power he could not yet understand. The pivotal moment, the event that would truly forge him, came when he was invited to a feast at the house of the smith Culann. The Morrigan walked beside the boy, a chill in the air only he could feel, as he made his way through the dusky fields. She knew what was to come. She saw the great iron chain hound that Culann loosed to guard his property, a beast the size of a calf, with jaws that could splinter oak and a heart as black as slag. When Setanta arrived, The hound, sensing a stranger, charged with a roar that shook the very gates. The boy had no weapon, but the Morrigan was there. She did not fight for him. That was not her way. Instead, she opened a channel within him. She showed him in a fraction of a heartbeat the beast's own fury, its simple, territorial violence. She mirrored it back at him, amplified 100-fold. Sitanta's Riastrad, his warp spasm, was not merely a berserker's rage. It was a divine possession, a temporary merging with the goddess of battle herself. His body contorted, twisting into a monstrous, terrifying form. One eye sucked back into his head, the other bulged out onto his cheek. His jaws unhinged, spewing fire and venom. His hair became a nest of sharpened spikes. The very air around him crackled with a bloody haze. He met the hound's charge not with evasion, but with a raw, explosive counterattack. He did not strangle the beast with his hands. He drove his own small fist down its throat and tore its heart out from the inside. The silence that followed was more deafening than the hound's roar. The boy stood panting, the Riastrad receding, leaving him pale and shaking, covered in the beast's gore. He had not just killed a guard dog. He had slain the embodiment of a challenge, and in doing so had sacrificed a part of his own humanity. The Morrigan watched as the shocked smith and king emerged. She heard Kulan's lament for his lost protector. She saw the flicker of guilt and resolve in Sitanta's eyes as he offered to take the hound's place until a new one could be raised. It was then that Cathbad, the druid, spoke the words that sealed his fate. "Henceforth you shall be Kulan, the Hound of Kulan." The name was a shackle of destiny. The Morrigan felt it click into place in the cosmic order. The weapon was now named. The hero was forged. As the boy, now the hound, was led inside to cleanse himself, the Morrigan remained outside in the growing dark. A single black feather drifted down from the roof of the smithy and landed in the pool of the hound's blood. She had overseen the tempering of the finest, sharpest blade that would ever be drawn in the defense of Ulster, and she knew with a chilling certainty that it would be her hand one day that would guide that blade to its final breaking point. The weeping of the Matcha. The world of men and gods is not a linear path, but a great interwoven tapestry. While the thread of Kulan's life was being spun with fiery brilliance in the north, another thread, older and dyed in sorrow, was being pulled taut in the same province of Ulster. The Morrigan, as Matcha, the embodiment of sovereign fury and maternal wrath, was drawn to a story unfolding at the court of King Conchobar mac Nessa himself. It began with a man, Cruniac mac Agnamine, a wealthy widower living alone on a rich farm. His life was one of quiet prosperity until the day a woman appeared at his door. She was stunningly beautiful, with a fierce intelligence in her eyes and a strength in her bearing that was both alluring and intimidating. She gave no name, no history. She simply moved in, and Cruniac, captivated, did not protest. She was, in truth, the goddess Matcha, one of the three faces of the Morrigan, taking mortal form for a time, seeking the simple, earthly comfort she so rarely knew. For a while, they were happy. Matcha brought an uncanny luck to the household. The fields were more fertile, the livestock healthier, the harvests more abundant. She became pregnant, and a deep, profound contentment settled over them both. It was a peace the Morrigan had never before allowed herself to experience. This peace was shattered by the boast of a foolish man. Cruniac was attending the great assembly of the Ulstermen at Amon Matcha.
The king's chariots were racing, and the warriors, filled with mead and pride, were lauding the speed of the royal horses. Drunk and swollen with pride in his own mysterious wife, Kruniak stood and shouted to the entire assembly, "My wife can run faster than the king's fastest horses." A stunned silence fell, followed by raucous laughter. King Conchobar, his pride stung, would not let such an insult to his royal stable stand. He sent his warriors to fetch Kruniak's wife, demanding she proved this outrageous claim. The Morrigan, Asmacha, was in the final throes of her pregnancy, her body heavy and aching when the king's men arrived. She pleaded with them, with the king, with anyone who would listen.
"I am days from giving birth," she begged, her voice strained with pain and fear. "To run now would be the death of me and my children." But the pride of the Ulstermen, and particularly of Conchobar, was a cold, unfeeling master. The king decreed that the law of the Onach was absolute. A boast had been made, and it must be proven, lest the one who made it be put to death. To save her husband's life, she had to run. A cold, murderous fury, familiar and yet more personal than ever before, settled over Macha. This was not the grand fury of a battlefield, but the intimate, white-hot rage of a mother and a wife being violated. She was marched to the starting line, her face pale, sweat beading on her brow from both labor pains and wrath. The Morrigan, the greater consciousness, watched through Macha's eyes. She saw the sneering faces of the warriors, the impatient gaze of Conchobar, the terrified, shame-filled face of her husband. She felt the twin lives within her kicking in protest. The signal was given. What followed was not a race, but an act of divine retribution. Macha did not simply run, she flew. Her pain and fury became a torrent of speed that left the king's prized horses foundering in the dust. She crossed the finish line far ahead of them, and as she did, she screamed, a scream that was not of victory, but of agony and curse. She collapsed onto the grass, and there, before the entire stunned assembly, she gave birth. Not to one child, but to twins, a boy and a girl. The labor was swift and brutal, fueled by her supernatural nature and her all-consuming rage. Us the infants drew their first breath, she drew hers to utter a prophecy, her voice echoing with the power of the Morrigan's triune nature. "Hear me, men of Ulster," she cried, her body trembling with the aftershocks of birth and power. "For the wrong you have done me this day, for the cruelty in your hearts and the weakness in your king's judgment, a curse shall fall upon you. From this day forth, in the hour of your kingdom's greatest peril, the weakness you forced upon me shall be visited upon you. You shall be seized with the pangs of childbirth, each and every one of you, for 5 days and 4 nights, leaving you helpless us infants when a foe is at your gate. This chaos noiden, this debility of 9, will cling to the warriors of Ulster for 9 generations." As she spoke the last word, her mortal form could no longer contain the fury. The form of Macha seemed to dissolve into a shimmer of light and shadow. She left the 2 newborn children on the grass, the twins who would be named Fir and Fial, true and honest, and her spirit, the essence of the Morrigan, withdrew, leaving behind a silence heavier than any tomb. The Ulstermen were struck dumb, not just by the curse, but by the terrifying divine presence that had just vanished from their midst. The Morrigan, retreating to the shadows, felt the new curse settle into the very bones of the land of Ulster. It was a ticking clock, a built-in vulnerability. She had not merely prophesied a future conflict, she had engineered its very conditions. The stage was now set. The hero, Cu Chulainn, was forged.
and the kingdom he would have to defend alone was now cursed to weakness in its time of need. The threads of fate were weaving together, and the pattern they formed was one of glorious, inevitable tragedy. The shadow over Amun Macha. The curse of Macha did not manifest itself as a constant, visible blight upon Ulster. Instead, it sank into the land like a slow-acting poison, seeping into the marrow of its warriors, a dormant weakness waiting for the specific trigger of the kingdom's greatest peril. For years, life proceeded. Boys grew into men, trained with sword and shield, and knew nothing of the debilitating agony that slept within them. The story of the weeping goddess became just another tale, a cautionary myth told by firesides. The Morrigan, however, felt the curse as a live wire humming just beneath the surface of the province. It was a masterwork of her own design, a perfect, cruel balance. It would not prevent a threat from arising. It would ensure that when the ultimate threat came, the defense would fall upon a single, superlative pair of shoulders, those of Cuchulainn. She watched the Hound of Ulster mature. She witnessed his training under the warrior woman Scatach in the realm of shadows, learning the fearsome Gay Bolga and the secrets of the warrior's art. She saw him return to Erin, a hero in full bloom, his exploits already the stuff of song. He was the embodiment of martial perfection, a shining, untouchable champion. And the Morrigan knew that such perfection, isolated and burdened, was the most fragile state of all. The trigger for the curse, the greatest peril, announced itself not with a declaration of war, but with a whisper of insatiable greed. The Morrigan's attention, ever divided, snapped to the west. Queen Meb of Connacht, the exiled daughter of Eochu Feidlech, had not been idle. She had married the powerful but pliable King Ailill, and through cunning, force of will, and sheer ruthlessness, she had made herself the true sovereign of Connacht. Her ambition, once a canker in her father's house, had now blossomed into a towering, poisonous tree. The Morrigan observed Meb's court. She salala alai wasala, the queen comparing her wealth to Ailill's, and the furious, competitive pride that ignited in her heart when she found she had one prized possession less than her husband. A legendary bull, Finn Benach, the white-horned, who had left her herd to join the king's. To be the equal of her husband in all things, Meb would require a bull to match it. Her scouts and spies brought word of the only possible rival, the Don Quailinga, the brown bull of Cooley, a beast of immense size and supernatural strength, who resided in Ulster. The Morrigan stood on the ramparts of Meb's fortress at Cruachan, invisible, as the queen declared her intent. It was not merely about a bull, it was about sovereignty, about dominance, about proving her worth in the most tangible way possible. Meb would have the brown bull, and if the Ulstermen would not give it, she would take it with the largest army ever assembled in Erin. The goddess felt the gears of fate begin to turn. Meb's pride was the spark. The brown bull was the pretext. The curse of Macha was the tinder, dry and waiting. And Cuchulainn was the lone, magnificent flame that would either consume the invasion or be consumed by it. She traveled ahead of the gathering Connacht host, a dark thought on the wind, and arrived in Ulster. She watched the normal life of the province, the farmers tending their fields, the warriors practicing at Eman Macha, the poets composing their verses. They were blissfully unaware of the storm gathering in the west and of the curse sleeping in their own bodies. The Morrigan went to the very spot where Macha had uttered her curse. The energy of the place was still potent, a knot of bitter magic tied to the land. She laid a hand upon the earth, feeling the dormant Kesnoinden pulsing like a sleeping serpent. It was ready.
The moment the first Connacht scouts set foot on Ulster soil with hostile intent, the curse would awaken. Her final stop was to observe Cú Chulainn. He was at Dún Delgan with his wife Emer.
The Morrigan watched from the shadows of the hall as the young hero laughed, his face unlined by the burden she knew he must soon bear. He was vibrant, alive, a creature of pure, untamed potential. For a fleeting moment, something akin to pity touched her cold heart. He was the perfect solution to a problem she had helped create, and his destruction was written into the very fabric of his role. As she turned away, the first of Med's advance riders crossed the border into Ulster. The Morrigan felt it instantly, but tremor in the spiritual fabric of the province. Far away, at Emain Macha, a warrior who had been sharpening his spear suddenly cried out, doubling over in crippling abdominal pain. Another, then all of them. The curse of Macha was upon them. The great hero Cú Chulainn, due to his peculiar, half-divine nature, was exempt. The Morrigan looked towards the setting sun, where Med's vast army was massing. Then she looked north, to where a single young man stood between his homeland and annihilation. The stage was set. The players were in their places. The great epic, the Táin Bó Cúailnge, had begun. And she, the Morrigan, would have a front-row seat to the carnage and a hand in guiding its most tragic hero. The single comb of the hound. The invasion of Ulster began not with a great crashing battle, but with a slow, creeping tide of men, horses, and steel. Queen Meb's host was a multi-provincial swarm, a river of polished shields and glinting spear points that flowed east from Cruachan, a moving city of ambition and violence. The Morrigan moved through this host like a chill, unseen by the warriors, but felt in the sudden, inexplicable dread that would clutch at a man's heart, or in the aggressive fury that would overwhelm another. She was the spirit of the war itself, and she was present at its birth. Her primary focus, however, was the lone figure standing athwart this tide. Cú Chulainn, upon learning of the invasion and the sudden, mysterious debility that had struck down all the other warriors of Ulster, had taken up a position at the fords and passes that served as the gateways into his homeland. His strategy was one of breathtaking audacity. He would not meet the army in a pitched battle, for that was impossible. Instead, he would challenge them to single combat, one champion at a time, using the ancient code of the Gelga, the single comb. The Morrigan positioned herself at a high, windswept crag overlooking the first major ford on the River Dee. Below, the vast encampment of the Connacht host sprawled like a blight, their campfires glittering like a field of fallen stars. And there, on the northern bank, stood Cú Chulainn. He was alone, a slender, youthful figure against the immense backdrop of the enemy, yet his presence was so potent it seemed to fill the entire valley. The first champion, a proud warrior from Connacht named Etar Comal, swaggered forth, hurling insults across the water. The Morrigan watched, her obsidian eyes missing nothing. She saw the flicker of impatience in Cú Chulainn's stance, the quick, hot anger that was his greatest strength and his most dangerous flaw. The exchange was brief. A challenge was issued and accepted. The two warriors fought in the shallow water of the ford, their movements a deadly, fluid dance. But it was no contest. Cú Chulainn's skill, honed by Scathach, was transcendent. He dispatched Etarkomal with a single precise thrust of his spear, Gai Bulg, leaving the body to drift downstream, a crimson stain spreading in the clear water. The Morrigan felt a thrill, not of bloodlust, but of appreciation. This was art. This was the pure, unadulterated expression of the martial principle she embodied. Day after day it continued. The Connacht host, frustrated and enraged, sent champion after champion. Nad Crantail, who fell. The mighty Morrigan, a namesake, a mere mortal, whose hubris amused the goddess, who was slain. Each combat was a brief, brutal vignette of death. Cuchulainn was not just fighting, he was performing a ritual of defense. Each dead champion was a warning, a testament to his invincibility. He was a one-man fence, and the fence was holding. The Morrigan observed the psychological war as closely as the physical one. She saw the fear growing in the eyes of Meb's warriors. They began to call him not by his name, but by epithets. The Hound, the Distorted One, the God of Death. His reputation became a weapon in itself, a specter that haunted their dreams. She saw Meb's frustration turn to cold, calculating fury. She saw Aiel's grudging respect for the boy hero. She saw the complex web of alliances and resentments. One evening, Cuchulainn cleansed his weapons in the river. After a day of killing, the Morrigan decided to make her presence known. She did not appear as a terrifying crone or a battle crow. She manifested as a young woman of startling beauty, tall and regal, dressed in a gown of rich, dark green, the color of the deep forest. She walked out of the twilight and stood on the opposite bank. Cuchulainn looked up, his senses, sharpened by battle, immediately on guard. "Who are you who walk so boldly in a place of death?" he called, his voice hoarse from the day's exertions. "I am a king's daughter," she replied, her voice melodious yet carrying an undertone of iron. "I have watched your deeds, Hound of Ulster. I have seen your strength, your valor. Such a hero should not be alone. I have brought my wealth and my love. Come with me, abandon this hopeless stand, rule with me in a distant land." It was a test, an offer of a different life, a path away from the certain doom that awaited him. She was offering him the sovereignty he fought for, without the cost. Cuchulainn did not even consider it. He shook his head, a weary but determined gesture. "I will not abandon my people to the she-wolf of Connacht. My honor is here, in this river, with this spear. I thank you for your offer, but I cannot accept it." The Morrigan's beautiful face hardened, the mask of the maiden slipping to reveal the goddess of fate beneath. "Then if you will not accept my love, you will earn my hate," she said, her voice losing its music, becoming the rasp of a whetstone. "I will oppose you in this war. I will be the eel that trips you in the ford. I will be the she-wolf that stampedes the cattle. I will be the white-red heifer that leads the herd astray. Remember this when you are hard-pressed, son of Luch. You had your choice." With that, her form dissolved into the gathering mist. Cuchulainn stood alone once more, the words of the strange woman echoing in his ears. He felt a new, deeper chill in the air, the chill of a divine enemy. The war had just become infinitely more complicated. The Morrigan, satisfied with his answer, retreated to the shadows. The Hound had chosen his path of glorious, tragic duty, and she would now ensure that path was alive his salam steep and as bloody as prophecy demanded. The eel, the wolf, and the heifer. The confrontation at the ford had sealed a new dimension of the conflict. It was no longer merely a war between Ulster and Connacht, nor a personal trial for Cuchulainn. It was now a divine contest, a game of fate played between the Hound and the Phantom Queen. The Morrigan, her offer of sovereignty spurned, embraced her role as the architect of his tribulations with a cold, creative fury. She did not confront him directly in battle. That was not her way. Instead, she became the land itself, turning its every feature against him. She was the spirit of obstruction, the embodiment of every ill-timed accident and piece of malicious luck. Her promise to oppose him was not an idle threat, but a sacred vow to the principles of strife she represented. The first test came during one of Cuchulainn's most desperate fights, against the mighty champion Loch Mac Mephabus. The two warriors were evenly matched, their struggle a whirlwind of skill and strength in the center of the river ford. Water churned to froth around their legs, the air ringing with the clash of their weapons. Cuchulainn was pressing an advantage, his feet finding purchase on the slick, round stones of the riverbed. It was then that the Morrigan struck. She shifted her essence, becoming one with the cold, dark water and the mud beneath. A thick, powerful eel, slick and sinuous as polished obsidian, wrapped itself around Cuchulainn's legs. It was not a creature of flesh and blood, but of pure, binding magic. Its coils tightened with supernatural strength, tripping him at the critical moment. He stumbled, his guard faltering for a split second. Loch Salalach his opening and lunged, his spear point grazing Cuchulainn's chest, drawing the first blood of the fight. A roar of fury and pain erupted from the hound. He did not see the eel as a mere animal, but recognized the divine malice behind it. With a tremendous heave of his godlike strength, he broke the eel's hold, but the damage was done. The rhythm of the fight was broken. He fought on, now forced to divide his attention between the warrior before him and the treacherous ground beneath his feet. The Morrigan did not relent. As the combat raged, she flowed from the water into the form of a great, gray she-wolf. She did not attack Cuchulainn directly. Instead, she surged from the reed beds on the riverbank, her yellow eyes fixed not on him, but on the herds of cattle that were being driven along with Meb's army, the very prize of this war. With snarls and calculated charges, she stampeded the panicked animals directly through the ford. A wall of bellowing, terrified flesh and sharp horns crashed into the fighting man. Loch was forced to leap aside to avoid being trampled. Cuchulainn, already off balance, was buffeted and knocked about by the bovine tide. The clean, honorable lines of the single combat were shattered into chaos. He was forced to fend off not only his human opponent, but the mindless, crushing weight of the herd, all while the spectral she-wolf darted at the edges of his vision, herding the cattle with malicious precision. Finally, as the stampede subsided and Cuchulainn, bleeding and enraged, sought to re-engage Loch, the Morrigan transformed a third time. She became a magnificent white-red heifer, the leader of the herd, her coat a startling blend of milk-white and blood-red. She placed herself at the head of the scattered, milling cattle and let out a long, lowing call that seemed to resonate with a strange, compelling magic. The confused animals, responding to her call, began to follow her, not back towards the Connacht camp, but deeper into Ulster, scattering into the woods and hills, making their recovery more difficult and prolonging the war. Cuchulainn saw the heifer, and in its strangely intelligent eyes he saw the same presence that had been the eel and the wolf. A cold, clear understanding dawned upon him. This was not a series of random misfortunes. This was a coordinated assault by the goddess he had rejected.
His battle was no longer just physical, it was spiritual. With a final, desperate burst of energy, he drove Locke back and turned his attention to the heifer. He loosed a stone from his sling, a weapon he had mastered as a boy. It flew true, striking the heifer squarely on the leg, shattering the bone. The creature, the Morrigan, let out a cry that was both bovine and profoundly, eerily human, and vanished into the mist that had begun to rise from the river. The fight with Locke ended inconclusively, both warriors exhausted and wounded. As the Connacht champion withdrew, Cuchulainn stood panting in the center of the ford, the water running red around his calves. He was victorious in that he had held the ford, but he was bloodied, humbled, and now acutely aware that he had a powerful, immortal enemy dedicated to his downfall. The Morrigan had shown him that his strength and skill were not enough. The very world could be turned against him. And as he limped from the water to tend his wounds, he knew this was only the beginning. The Queen of Phantoms had just begun to play her game. The binding of the wounds. The mist that rose from the River Dee in the aftermath of the battle was thick and cold, clinging to Cuchulainn's skin like a shroud. The physical wounds from Loch's spear were sharp and clear, but the deeper injury was one of the spirit. The goddess had marked him, not just with her attacks, but with her presence. He felt her malevolent attention like a constant pressure at the back of his skull, a shadow that would not lift even in the brief moments of rest he managed to steal. He retreated to a small, hidden bothy, a hunter's shelter, a little way from the ford, his body screaming in protest with every step. The Riestrad, the warp spasm, always left him drained and fragile, a godlike power receding to leave a weary young man in its wake. He built a small, smokeless fire and began the painful process of cleaning his wounds. The gash on his chest was deep, and the bruises from the stampeding cattle were already flowering into dark, painful blossoms across his ribs and back. He was alone, truly alone, in a way he had never been before. The weight of Ulster, the frustration of the stalled war, and the chilling enmity of a goddess pressed down on him. For the first time, a flicker of despair, cold and insidious, touched his heart. How could he fight an enemy who was the river, the wolf, the very air? It was in this state of vulnerability that she came to him again. This time, she did not appear as a beautiful maiden or a terrifying beast. She came as an old woman, a Kayach, bent and wizened, her face a web of deep lines, her eyes milky with age. She hobbled into the circle of firelight, leaning on a staff of blackthorn wood, a small leather pouch hanging from her belt. She seemed so harmless, so mundane, a part of the ancient landscape. "A cold night for a wounded man to be alone," she croaked, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. Cuchulainn's hand went to his sword, but the effort sent a spike of pain through his chest. He eyed her warily.
"Who are you, grandmother?" "Just an old woman who knows the ways of herbs and hurts," she said, gesturing to her pouch. "I salalla the fight at the ford. I salalla you wounded. A hero should not die of festering wounds in a ditch. Let me tend to you." He was suspicious, but his body was crying out for relief, and her presence held no immediate threat. He gave a curt nod. The old woman knelt beside him, her movements surprisingly fluid for her apparent age. She opened her pouch, revealing a collection of dried herbs, mosses, and a small clay jar of salve. Her hands, though gnarred, were gentle as she cleaned the spear wound with water from his own canteen.
As she worked, she began to speak, her voice a low, hypnotic murmur. "The one who attacked you today, you know who she is, do you not?" Cuchulainn grunted in pain as she applied a poultice of crushed comfrey and yarrow. "The Morrigan, she offered me her favor. I refused it." "A dangerous one to refuse," the crone clucked, tying a clean strip of linen around his chest. "She is the tide of battle. She is the choosing of the slain. To have her as an enemy is to fight the wind and the rain." "What would you have me do?" Cuchulainn asked, bitterness edging his tone. "Abandon my people, my honor?" The old woman finished binding his wound and sat back, her milky eyes seeming to see right through him. "No, a man's doom is his own. But even an enemy can be appeased. Even a goddess respects a bold heart. When next you see her, in whatever form she takes, do not seek to destroy her. Acknowledge her, honor her, even in her enmity. For she is a power of this land, as much as the mountain or the sea, and to deny her is to deny a part of the truth of this world." She placed the clay jar of salve in his hand. "Use this on the bruises. It will draw out the pain." Then she rose, leaning on her staff. "Remember my words, Hound of Ulster. The greatest warriors know when to fight and when to make an offering." With that, she turned and hobbled back into the mist, vanishing as completely as she had appeared. Cuchulainn was left alone with the dying fire and the jar of salve in his hand. He knew with absolute certainty that the old woman had been the Morrigan herself. This was not another attack. It was a lesson, a test of a different kind. She had wounded him, and then she had healed him. She had shown her wrath, and then she had offered her cryptic wisdom. She placed the clay jar of salve in his hand. "Use this on the bruises. It will draw out the pain." Then she rose, leaning on her staff. "Remember my words, Hound of Ulster. The greatest warriors know when to fight and when to make an offering." With that, she turned and hobbled back into the mist, vanishing as completely as she had appeared. Cuchulainn was left alone with the dying fire and the jar of salve in his hand. He knew with absolute certainty that the old woman had been the Morrigan herself. This was not another attack. It was a lesson, a test of a different kind. She had wounded him, and then she had healed him. She had shown her her wrath, and then she had offered her cryptic wisdom.
She was demonstrating her complex, multifaceted nature, not merely a bringer of death, but a necessary, if terrifying, part of the cosmic order. He applied the salve to his bruises, and a surprising warmth spread through his aching muscles, easing the pain. He lay back, staring at the roof of the bothy. The despair had lifted, replaced by a grim, newfound respect. His enemy was immortal, capricious, and held the power of life and death in her hands. But she had also, in her own strange way, given him a key to surviving her. He had to acknowledge her, to honor the strife itself. It was a paradoxical, difficult truth, but for the first time, Cuchulainn felt he was beginning to understand the true nature of the war he was fighting. It was a war not just for land or cattle, but for the soul of a hero, orchestrated by a goddess who was both his nemesis and his most demanding teacher. The ford of the final gasp. The war ground on, a seemingly endless cycle of single combats, skirmishes, and stalemate. The seasons turned, and the green of summer gave way to the gold and crimson of autumn.
The land itself seemed weary of the bloodshed. The Morrigan watched it all, a patient spectator to the slow unraveling of a hero. Cuchulainn, though still undefeated in combat, was a specter of his former self. The constant fighting, the lack of sleep, the psychological weight of his solitary defense, and the ever-present knowledge of the Morrigan's enmity had worn him down to the bone. His eyes, once bright with fiery confidence, were now sunken and shadowed, holding the grim knowledge of a man staring into his own grave. The Morrigan knew the end was approaching. She could feel it in the tightening of the cosmic weave, in the way the shadows lengthened around the hound. The final act required a catalyst, a weapon that could bypass his divine skill and strike at the heart of his humanity. That weapon was Ferdia, his foster brother. She observed the friendship that had been forged in the Land of Shadows under Skathok's tutelage. She had seen them train together, share secrets, swear oaths of eternal brotherhood. It was a bond as strong as tempered steel. And so, it had to be the instrument of his destruction. She drifted through Meb's camp, a whisper of malignant inspiration, feeding the queen's cunning mind with the perfect, cruel strategy. Meb, using a combination of bribes, threats, and appeals to Ferdia's honor, compelled him to face Cuchulainn. The Morrigan watched us, the conflicted warrior, a man of immense strength and skill, second only to the hound himself, was manipulated onto the path of fratricide. The stage was set at the same river ford where so much blood had already been spilled. The air on the morning of the combat was preternaturally still and cold. A heavy frost silvered the grass, and the river ran sluggish and gray. The Morrigan took her place on the same high crag, her form a part of the gathering mist. This was the culmination of her work, the tragic symphony she had composed. She watched us, the two foster brothers, met in the center of the ford. There were no insults, no boasts, only a sad, weary recognition of the terrible fate that bound them. "Must we do this, Ferdia?" Cuchulainn's voice was hollow. "The guess is upon me, my brother," Ferdia replied, his face a mask of anguish. "I have no choice." The fight began. It was unlike any that had come before. This was not a contest of hero against champion, but a brutal, intimate tragedy. They were so evenly matched, knowing each other's every move, every feint, every trick. For 3 days they fought, from dawn until dusk. They used every weapon, spears, swords, shields, until they were broken and discarded. They fought until their bodies were a tapestry of cuts and bruises, their breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The river ran pink, then red with their mingled blood. The Morrigan observed it all with a profound, silent intensity. She saw the love that persisted even as they tried to kill one another. She saw the shared memories flash in their eyes with every blow exchanged. This was the true horror of war, the aspect she embodied that was far worse than simple death, the rending of sacred bonds. On the evening of the 3rd day, both men were at the limit of their endurance. They stood chest-deep in the cold, bloody water, leaning on their spears for support. They embraced, each knowing the next day would be the last. The following morning, Cuchulainn, his soul screaming in protest, knew he could hold nothing back. The Gai Bulg, the terrible barbed spear that Skathok had taught only him, was his final, grim resort. When the moment came, when Ferdia left a tiny, almost imperceptible opening in his defense, Cuchulainn let the spear fly. It struck Ferdia, and its horrific barbs expanded inside him, tearing him apart from within.
Ferdia fell. Cuchulainn caught him, cradling his foster brother's head in his arms. The great warrior's final breath was not a curse, but a sigh of release. "My brother," Cuchulainn wept, his tears cutting clean paths through the grime and blood on his face. "I am sorry. I am so sorry." The Morrigan watched from her perch. This was the moment. The hero was broken. He had won the combat, but he had lost a part of his soul. The invincible hound was now vulnerable, his spirit pierced by a grief more profound than any physical wound. The victory was ashes in his mouth. She did not feel triumph. She felt the completion of a pattern, the satisfying click of a final, tragic piece falling into place. The bond of brotherhood had been the strongest thread in Cuchulainn's tapestry, and she had guided the shears that cut it. Cuchulainn lifted his foster brother's body and carried it from the river, his own steps faltering and slow. The Morrigan knew the end was now inevitable. The hound had fought his last great fight. All that remained was the closing of the trap, the weaving of the final snare. The death of Ferdia was a seismic event that reverberated through both armies, but its most profound impact was on the soul of Cuchulainn. He carried the body of his foster brother from the ford with a slow, funeral tread, his own heart a cold, dead weight in his chest. He granted Ferdia every honor, seeing to his burial with a grief so deep it was beyond tears. After the rites were complete, he withdrew from the front lines, a ghost haunting the edges of the war. He still held the fords, but the fire was gone. He fought now from duty alone, a automaton going through the motions of violence, his spirit still lying in the grave beside his brother. The Morrigan observed this transformation with a clinical eye. The hero's will was shattered. The final phase of the prophecy could now be enacted. It was time to weave the last inescapable strands of the snare. She did not need to confront him directly again. His own despair and the relentless machinations of his mortal enemies would suffice. She drifted through the Connacht camp, her presence a catalyst for the most desperate and cunning strategies. She whispered to the sons of Calakin, a clan of wizards and poisoners whose family members had fallen to Cuchulainn's spear. Their hatred was a ripe fruit, and she plucked it.
She filled their minds with visions of sorcerous tricks, of illusions and enchantments designed not to defeat the hound in fair fight, but to confuse, disorient, and break the last of his resolve. She also watched the political maneuvering. She saw the concern growing among the Ulstermen. Their champion was a wounded animal, and the curse was nearing its end. The warrior Conchobar, recovering from the pangs, knew they had to get Cuchulainn to rest, to heal, or he would be lost. They used trickery themselves, inventing a false mustering of all the Ulster exiles to lure him from the front, giving him a chance to recuperate at a nearby healing center. The Morrigan allowed this. A brief respite would only make the final fall more poignant. She watched Cuchulainn, weary beyond measure, accepted the ruse and went to the house of the healing women. But even here, her influence seeped in. She appeared in the dreams of the Connacht scouts, guiding them to discover the truth of his location. The net was closing. The final threads were the Gesa, the sacred personal taboos that bound every hero. Cuchulainn had 3, and the Morrigan now ensured that all 3 would be violated in quick succession, stripping him of his divine protection and leaving him utterly exposed.
First, he was offered dog meat, and due to his exhaustion and the clever wording of the offer that a great hero should not refuse the hospitality of a poor house, he was tricked into eating it, thus breaking his guess never to eat the flesh of his namesake. Then, as he prepared to ride out to what he knew would be his final battle, he saw the washer at the ford, a bin-nich, a harbinger of death, washing the blood-stained armor of the soon-to-die. It was the Morrigan herself in one of her most ancient and terrifying aspects. She looked up from her grisly work, and her eyes met his. She did not speak, but the message was clear. She was washing his armor. Finally, as he rode towards his fate, he saw 3 crones, the Morrigna, her triple form, huddled by the roadside, roasting a dog on a rowan spit. They called out to him, offering him a portion. To refuse hospitality to a woman, especially an elder, was another of his gesa. Trapped, sick at heart, knowing the meat was forbidden, he accepted a portion and ate it. As he did, the strength in his left arm and side, the side that had taken the portion, faded.
The final protection was gone. Uskuchulain rode on, his body weakened, his spirit broken, his divine safeguards stripped away. The Morrigan watched him go. The snare was complete. Every strand, the grief for Ferdia, the sorcery of the Calatin sons, the breaking of his Jessa, was woven together into a net of fate from which there was no escape. She had guided, she had tempted, she had threatened, and she had prophesied. Now her work was almost done. All that remained was to witness the final, fleeting bloom of his glory, and then the long, dark silence that would follow. The last stand of the Hound. The ride to the final battlefield was a procession through a landscape of omens. The sky was a lid of low, leaden cloud, and a cold wind whispered through the bare branches of the winter trees, carrying the scent of wet earth and decay. Kukuchulai knew he was riding to his death. Every broken jest, every portent, the vision of the washer at the ford, they were all signposts on a road that had only one destination. Yet he did not turn back. Honor, that terrible and beautiful master, demanded he face his end with a spear in his hand. The Morrigan did not accompany him on this final journey. She had already set the stage. Instead, she waited at the place known as the Pillar Stone, a lone menhir standing in a desolate stretch of land. This was where he had chosen to make his stand, tying himself to the stone so he could die on his feet, facing his enemies. She stood beside the cold granite, a part of the gathering twilight, her form indistinct, the very air around her holding its breath. She felt him approach before she saw him. His life force, once a blazing sun, was now a guttering candle. Yet it burned with a final, desperate intensity. He rode in his war chariot, driven by his loyal charioteer, Leg. But the vehicle was battered, the horses lathered and wild-eyed. When he reached the pillar stone, his movements were stiff, pained. He dismounted and, with Leg's help, used his own torn cloak to bind himself upright to the menhir, his sword held fast in his hand. "Now," he whispered, his voice raspy, "we wait." The Morrigan watched, a silent monument to fate. As the army of Connacht, led by Lugaid, the son of Curoi, and the vengeful sons of Calatin, surrounded the lone pillar. They were cautious at first, fearing a final supernatural trick. They circled him like wolves around a wounded stag, their spears held ready. Then the first spear was thrown. It struck Kuchulain in the chest, a deep, wounding blow. He did not cry out. A second spear followed, then a third. Each impact jarred his body against the stone, but his legs, bound fast, held him upright. His eyes, though clouded with pain, remained open, fixed on the horizon. The Morrigan observed the scene with an immeasurable, ancient stillness. This was not the glorious, frenzied death of a hero in the heat of battle. This was an execution, a slow, methodical unmaking. It was, in its own way, more terrible and more sacred than any death on the open field. It was the ultimate sacrifice, the conscious, willing acceptance of annihilation for the sake of a code. A lake of crimson pooled at the base of the pillar stone. His lifeblood soaked the earth, a final, potent offering to the land he had died to protect. The crows began to gather, circling high above, but they did not descend. Not yet. They waited for her signal. It was then that the last of his strength manifested. An otter, drawn by the scent of blood, came to drink from the pool at his feet. It was a mundane, natural act, but in that moment it was a profound desecration. With a final explosive surge of will, Cuchulainn looked down, and his rage at this indignity was so pure, so absolute, that the Riastrad took him one last time. His face contorted, a death mask of fury, and a light, terrible and beautiful, blazed from his eyes. The otter fled. The surrounding warriors flinched back, shields raised, believing for a moment that the dying god was about to rise again. But the light faded as quickly as it had come. The effort had been the last. The great heart within his ravaged chest beat one final, shuddering time, and then was still. A profound silence fell over the battlefield. The wind died. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic drip of blood onto the saturated ground. The Morrigan stepped forward from the shadows, now fully visible to the mortal eyes that dared to look upon her. She was in her aspect as the bub, the battle crow, but also as the sovereign of the slain. She walked to the base of the pillar and looked up at the body of the hero, tied to the stone, his head fallen forward onto his chest. She felt no triumph, no sorrow, only a vast, cosmic completion. The thread of his life, which she had watched from its spark to its brilliant, blazing arc, was now extinguished. The otter fled. The surrounding warriors flinched back, shields raised, believing for a moment that the dying god was about to rise again. But the light faded as quickly as it had come. The effort had been the last. The great heart within his ravaged chest beat one final, shuddering time, and then was still. A profound silence fell over the battlefield. The wind died. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic drip of blood onto the saturated ground. The Morrigan stepped forward from the shadows, now fully visible to the mortal eyes that dared to look upon her. She was in her aspect as the bab, the battle crow, but also as the sovereign of the slain. She walked to the base of the pillar and looked up at the body of the hero, tied to the stone, his head fallen forward onto his chest. She felt no triumph, no sorrow, only a vast, cosmic completion. The thread of his life, which she had watched from its spark to its brilliant, blazing arc, was now extinguished. The prophecy was fulfilled. The cycle was complete. She reached out a hand and touched the cold stone, feeling the echo of his final, defiant breath. Then she looked to the sky and let out a single, piercing cry. It was the cry of the crow, the lament of the goddess, the sound of an era ending. At her signal, the crows descended. But they did not land on Cuchulainn. They landed around her, on the pillar, on the ground, a silent, black-feathered court. They were not there to despoil, but to bear witness. The Hound of Ulster was dead, and the Morrigan, his nemesis and his destiny, was there to claim the story of his end. The claiming of the head. The silence that followed Cuchulainn's death was brittle, sacred, and short-lived. The awe that had frozen the Connacht warriors shattered, replaced by a ghoulish and triumphant frenzy. They had slain the monster, the hound, the untouchable champion. Now they wanted a trophy. Lugaid Mac Conroy, believing himself the one to have dealt the final blow, strode forward, his sword drawn, his intent clear. He would take the head of Cuchulainn as the ultimate prize of this long and bloody war. The Morrigan watched him approach, her expression unreadable. The mortal craving for validation through desecration was a petty, predictable thing, but it was part of the tapestry of war she governed. As Lugaid raised his sword to sever the head from the body tied to the pillar, she did not move to stop him. But she did not allow it to be an easy victory. With a sound like a thunderclap, the sword of Cuchulainn, which had fallen from his lifeless hand, clattered to the ground from where it had been leaning against the stone. As it fell, the blade, still imbued with a fading echo of the hero's power, flashed in the dull light. It did not strike anyone, but its sudden movement, so full of latent intention, caused Lugaid to startle and falter in his stroke. His blow, meant to be clean, was instead a ragged hack. It was a final, post-humanist defiance, a last whisper of the hound's will, permitted by the goddess who oversaw the scene. As the head was lifted, a gruesome prize, a miracle or a curse occurred. From the severed neck, a light not of this world seemed to bloom, and from the lips of the severed head came a voice, clear and strong, echoing across the silent field. "It is a glorious thing, Lugaid," the head spoke, "to celebrate the feast of a victory. But tell me, do you feel like a victor?" The voice was Cuchulainn's.
The warriors gasped and fell back, crossing themselves or gripping their amulets. Lugaid stood frozen, the head held before him, its dead eyes seeming to stare into his soul. "You have my head," the voice continued, a terrible, calm wisdom in its tone. "But you have not taken my honor. You stand over my body, but you will never stand in my shadow. The story of this day will not be your victory, Lugaid. It will be my stand. Men will sing of Cuchulainn at the pillar stone long after they have forgotten the name of the man who struck him down." The Morrigan allowed a faint, cold smile to touch her lips. This was her doing. She had given the hero this final voice, this last, devastating piece of propaganda. She was the keeper of stories as much as the bringer of death, and she would ensure the correct version was told. The head spoke one last time, its gaze seeming to sweep over the entire host. "The red branch of Ulster may be broken, but its seed will sprout again. This land remembers its defenders." Then the light faded from the head. It was merely a dead thing now, a piece of meat in Lugaid's trembling hands. The magic was spent, the connection severed, but the damage was done. The triumph of the Connacht warriors was now hollow, poisoned by the ghost of the man they had killed.
They had won the battle, but the dead hero had won the story. The Morrigan turned her attention from the head to the headless body still tied to the stone. This was the vessel that had housed the magnificent, terrible spirit. This was what remained of the sunfire of Luch and the passion of mortality. The crows, at her unspoken command, finally took flight, not towards the head, but towards the body, not to defile, but to stand vigil. She then looked south, towards Ulster. She felt the moment the news reached Iman Macha. She felt the wail of Emmer, Cuchulain's wife, a sound of such pure desolation that it seemed to crack the sky. She felt the grim sorrow of Concobar and the Ulster warriors, now free of the curse, but shackled by a loss from which they would never truly recover. The Morrigan had claimed her due. She had overseen the rise, the glory, and the fall of the greatest hero of his age. She had guided his fate to its preordained tragic conclusion. The story of Cuchulainn was complete, and as the Connacht host, their victory soured, began to withdraw from the pillar stone, leaving the headless body to the crows and the coming night, the Morrigan remained.
She was the silence after the scream, the darkness after the light, the eternal witness to the price of glory, the unraveling tapestry. With the fall of Cuchulainn, a vital thread in the tapestry of Erin was snipped, and the entire weave began to loosen. The Morrigan, her immediate purpose with the hound fulfilled, did not retreat into solitude. Instead, she became a silent witness to the slow, inexorable unraveling that his death had set in motion. The great epic was over, but the aftershocks would ripple through the ages. She watched us, the Connacht host, bearing the gruesome trophy of Cuchulainn's head, returned to Cruachan. There was no grand celebration. The head's final prophecy had seen to that. The victory felt pyrrhic, the air thick with the knowledge that they had not conquered a man, but felled a pillar of the world. Queen Med, though she had her bull, found the prize ashen in her mouth. The Don Qualne, the great brown bull, upon meeting the white-horned Finnbenach, fought a battle of titans that mirrored the human war, and both beasts perished, their blood soaking the earth of Connacht. It was a fitting, dismal end to the conflict. No true victor, only death and exhaustion. The Morrigan stood in the midst of the aftermath. She felt the slow decline of the heroic age. The Ulstermen, though freed from the curse, were broken in spirit. King Conchaba's reign, once golden, was now shadowed by the loss of his greatest champion. The stories told around the fires grew more wistful, speaking of a time when giants walked the land, a time that was now palpably over. She saw the new generations rise, lesser men with smaller dreams. The old codes of honor, so fiercely upheld by Cuchulainn, began to erode, replaced by pragmatism and a quieter, more desperate kind of survival. The forts of the Tuatha De Danann, the Brúch na Boine, and the other Side mounds began to feel more distant, their doors closing to the world of men. The gods were retreating, their time of direct intervention passing into memory. The Morrigan felt this shift in her own being. The vibrant, violent song of the land was changing key, becoming softer, more mournful, threaded with the melancholy of passing. She, the embodiment of its most ferocious aspects, found the world growing quieter around her. The great defining wars were over.
What remained were the squabbles of chieftains, the petty conflicts that held no interest for a goddess of her stature. She walked through forests that seemed less deep, by rivers that seemed less potent with magic.
She visited the old sites of power, the well of Segais, the paps of Anu, the stone where she had tested Eochu Feidlich. They still hummed with energy, but it was a slumbering power, a memory of what once was. During this long twilight of the gods, she encountered the Dagda one last time. He found her standing on the shore of the western sea, watching the sun bleed into the water. He looked older, his vast strength diminished, the vitality he had sacrificed at their union never fully returned. "The world grows thin, Morrigu," he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "It changes, good God," she replied, not turning to look at him. "It always changes. The wheel turns." "Our children are leaving the world to the sons of Mil," he said, a profound sadness in his eyes. "They will tell stories about us. They will build mounds over our homes and call them fairy forts. They will forget the taste of Goibichnius ale and the sound of Ogma's poetry. And they will remember the war," the Morrigan said, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "They will remember the fury and the prophecy. They will remember the hound tied to the stone. Our legacy is written in blood and glory, Eochad Olathar. That is a legacy that endures." The Dagda was silent for a long time. Was it worth it? The cost? Finally, she turned to him. Her obsidian eyes held no regret, only the calm, terrible acceptance of eternity. It was necessary. The land endures. The song continues, even if the melody has changed. That is all that matters. He nodded, a slow, heavy gesture. Then he turned and walked away, his broad back fading into the gathering dusk. It was the last time she would speak with him as an active power in the world. The Morrigan was left alone with the sighing of the sea. The age of epic heroes and clashing gods was ending. A new age, an age of history and faith, was dawning. Her work in the foreground was done. But a goddess does not die. She evolves. She retreats. She waits. The tapestry of the old world was unraveling, and she, the phantom queen, would now become a thread within the new one, woven into the very fabric of myth and memory. From goddess to folklore. The centuries that followed were a long, slow descent into silence for the old gods. The Milesians, the sons of Mil, became the Gaels, and their culture spread across Erin like a new blanket of snow, covering but not erasing the ancient features of the land.
The great fortresses of the Tuatha De Danann were abandoned, their structures sinking into the earth, becoming the Side Mounds, the dwelling places of the Ao Sea, the people of the mounds, who were now seen less as gods and more as powerful, capricious fairies. The Morrigan felt this transformation not us a diminishment, but us a metamorphosis. She was no longer a figure who walked openly in the world, dictating the fates of kings and the outcomes of battles. Instead, she seeped into the subconscious of the land and its people. She became the dread that clutched a soldier's heart the night before a battle. She was the sudden, inexplicable terror that made a horse rear on a lonely path at dusk. She was the figure seen from the corner of the eye, a woman in a dark cloak vanishing into the mist of a bog. Her name was spoken less in reverence and more in superstition. Farmers would leave small offerings at lonely hawthorn trees, a splash of milk, a bit of butter, to appease the Morrigan and keep her from bringing blight to their cattle.
To see a crow behaving strangely, especially near a battlefield or a place of execution, was to have seen the bod, a sure portent of death. The story of Macha and her curse was told to explain why the men of Ulster had once been struck down, a tale to make sense of an ancient, inexplicable historical defeat. She watched as the new faith arrived on the island, carried by monks in simple robes, their message one of a single, loving God and his sacrificed Son. They built their monasteries and high crosses on the very sites of old power. They transcribed the old stories, but they changed them. The Tuatha De Danann were recast as a race of skilled, magical humans who had come from the north, not as deities. The Morrigan was often diminished, sometimes portrayed as a trio of war goddesses, her unity and complexity fractured by the new scribes who did not fully understand the nature of the power they were recording. The Morrigan observed this with a detached, ancient amusement. She stood in the shadows of a new monastery and listened to a monk painstakingly copy the tale of the Tyne Bo Cuelnia. She saw him pause at her name, his hand trembling slightly as he dipped his quill. He felt her, even if he called her a demon. She was the old darkness that his new light sought to banish, but could only push to the edges. She visited the sleeping forms of the other gods in their Side mounds. The Dagda slept deeply, his club beside him. Luh's light was banked, waiting for a need that might never come again. They were dreaming the long dream of the forgotten. But the Morrigan did not sleep. Her nature was too active, too tied to the perpetual, low-level strife of the world. War did not end with the gods. It merely became a mortal affair, and she was its eternal spirit. She manifested occasionally to those whose hearts were still tuned to the old frequencies. A poet on the verge of a great satire, filled with a destructive, creative fury, might feel her inspiration. A warrior, in the heat of a desperate last stand, might feel a cold, fierce energy fill his limbs, and he would fight with a preternatural skill he could not explain. In these moments, she was still real, still a force. Her legacy was no longer one of direct action, but of influence. She was the archetype of the terrible feminine, the sovereign who must be confronted, the prophet of bloodshed. She was the reason why a crow's caw could chill the blood, why a lone woman by a roadside could be a thing of fear or omen. She had been woven from a goddess of a specific people into a universal symbol of fate, war, and the dark side of sovereignty. The world had changed, but the Morrigan endured, transformed from a living deity into a permanent, haunting feature of the landscape of the human soul. The echo in the stone. 1,000 winters passed. The world the Morrigan had known was buried not only in memory, but under the strata of new cities, new faiths, new wars fought for new gods and ideologies. The language of the Gaels softened and changed, and the old stories became the province of scholars and enthusiasts, tales to be studied, not lived. The land of Ira was now Ireland, and its green fields were crosshatched with stone walls and quiet country lanes. The Morrigan existed as a persistent resonance, a vibration in the bedrock of the island. She was the chill in the air at the hill of Tara, where the Lia Fáil no longer cried out for a king. She was the oppressive silence in the chamber of the great mound at Newgrange, which men now called Brú na Boine, a tourist attraction whose true purpose they could only guess at. She was the fleeting shadow that schoolchildren pointed to on a school trip, a trick of the light they would soon forget. Her consciousness was not linear. It drifted like fog, touching moments in time, connecting to echoes of the past. She found anchors in places where blood had been spilled in great quantity, where the old energy still clung. The plain of Mactwirid was now peaceful farmland, but when the plow turned over the soil in a certain light, she could still smell the iron tang of Morrigan and divine blood. The ford where Cuckoo Lane fought his last fights was a concrete bridge now, but beneath the modern noise of cars, she could still hear the clash of spear on shield and the final, ragged gasp of Ferdia. It was at the pillar stone where Cuckoo Lane had fallen that she felt the most potent echo. The stone itself was still there, a weathered, gray sentinel in a field, ignored by the sheep that grazed around it. Most people who passed saw it only a rock. But sometimes a person would come who was more sensitive, whose soul was tuned to the older frequencies. One such was a young woman, an archaeologist, who came to the site with her team. They were conducting a survey, mapping the area with ground-penetrating radar and drones. The woman, Dr. Aisling Keene, felt a profound and inexplicable melancholy the moment she laid a hand on the cold, rough surface of the pillar. It was a feeling that went beyond academic interest. It was a personal, visceral sorrow. The Morrigan, drawn by this flicker of recognition, stirred. She did not manifest as a woman or a crow. Instead, she became a pressure in the air, a concentration of memory. As Dr. Keene worked, taking measurements and photographs, she began to experience flashes of sensation that were not her own. The smell of frost and blood, the metallic taste of fear, the sound of labored breathing, and the cawing of a crow. That night, camping near the site, Dr. Keene dreamed. She was not herself in the dream. She was standing, bound to a stone, her body a map of agony. She looked out and saw a circle of hostile, shadowy figures. She felt a love so profound it was a physical pain, and a duty so heavy it was crushing her. And she felt a presence, a vast, watching intelligence, neither good nor evil, but utterly inevitable. She woke with a start, her face wet with tears. The dream had felt more real than the waking world. She left her tent and walked to the pillar stone in the moonlight. The field was silent, bathed in silver. The Morrigan was there, a shimmer in the moonlight, a whisper in the wind.
She did not speak, but she pushed an image, a memory, into the woman's mind. The moment Kuchulan Salalahi Wassalam, the otter, drink his blood, and the final, futile surge of his glorious rage. Dr. Keene gasped, stumbling back a step. She felt no fear, only an overwhelming, tragic awe. She understood, in that moment, that the stories were not just stories. They were recordings, emotional fossils embedded in the landscape. The hero, the tragedy, the goddess, they were all still here, imprinted on the very atoms of the place. She didn't see a goddess before her, but she felt her. She felt the ancient, weary, and resolute spirit of the land itself, a spirit that had presided over countless cycles of creation and destruction. It was the Morrigan, not us a character from a book, but us the enduring consciousness of conflict and consequence. The next day, Dr. Keene packed her equipment. Her data was complete, but she knew her report would be a dry, scientific document. The real discovery was one she could never publish. As her team drove away, she looked back at the pillar stone. A single crow was perched on its top, perfectly still. It did not seem to be a random bird, but a sentinel, a keeper of the story. The Morrigan watched the car disappear. The connection was broken. The modern world, with its noise and speed, reasserted itself. But for a moment, an echo had been heard. A thread of the old tapestry had vibrated, connecting the deep past to the fleeting present. It was enough. The stone held the memory. The land held the truth. And she, the Morrigan, would continue to be its guardian,
waiting in the silence for the next heart that was open enough to listen. The sovereignty of the concrete world. The 20th century arrived with a roar of machinery and the staccato rhythm of gunfire. The Morrigan, a specter in the peat smoke and the industrial fog, found the nature of strife had transformed. The conflicts were no longer the clear, archetypal clashes of king against king or hero against monster. They were messy, ideological, fought in trenches and city streets with weapons that killed at a distance, divorcing the act from the intimate horror of the spear thrust or the sword blow. The scale of the slaughter was immense, an industrial harvest of death that, for a time, saturated the spiritual atmosphere of the entire world.
She walked the fields of Flanders in the mind of a young Irish soldier, feeling his terror as the earth shook from shelling, a far cry from the shaking of the ground from the charge of warrior bands. The fury was there, the fear was there, but the context was alien. This was not a war for the sovereignty of a sacred land, but for lines on a map and the ambitions of empires. She could feed the battle fury in a man's heart, but it felt diluted, a pale reflection of the sacred rage of a cuckoo-line. Then the conflict came to her own island. The struggle for Irish independence and the civil war that followed was a return to a more intimate and therefore more potent kind of violence. This was a war for the land itself, for the right to its own song. The Morrigan felt the old energies stir. She was the determination in the heart of the men and women in the General Post Office during the Easter Rising, a defiant stand against an empire, a faint, distant echo of a hound at a ford. She was the bitter sorrow of the Civil War, the fratricide that mirrored the tragedy of Ferdia and Cuchulainn, brother against brother, tearing the nascent nation apart. She stood on the bridges of Dublin, not as a crow, but as the chill that ran down the spine of a sentry. She was the sudden, inexplicable certainty in a volunteer that they were walking into an ambush. The old patterns repeated, albeit on a smaller, more political scale. The sovereignty of the land was being fought for once more, and she was its ancient, terrible spirit. But the world moved on. Independence was won. The concrete spread. Dublin became a city of neon and global commerce. The old rhythms were subsumed by the frantic, disconnected pace of modern life. The Morrigan found herself adrift in a world that had no time for omens. A crow on a telephone wire was just a bird. A feeling of dread before a business meeting was just anxiety. She tried to find anchors. She lingered at sites of political power, the new Seethe mounds of Leinster House. But the conflicts here were of words and procedure, a bloodless shadow play that held no sustenance for her. She attended modern sporting events, feeling the roar of the crowd, the tribal passions. But it was a transient, manufactured fury, lacking the ultimate stakes of life and death. She was becoming a relic, not just in memory, but in function. What was a goddess of war and fate in a world that had systematized conflict and dismissed the concept of destiny? Her prophecy felt irrelevant in an age of polling data and statistical analysis. One gray afternoon, she found herself standing on O'Connell Street, watching the endless flow of traffic and people. The noise was a constant, meaningless roar. The faces were hurried, distracted, their inner lives closed off behind screens and schedules. For the first time in her eternal existence, the Morrigan felt a profound and unsettling emotion, irrelevance. The land was still there, beneath the asphalt. Its song was still being sung, but it was drowned out by the static of the modern world. The sovereignty of Era was now a matter of economics and EU policy, not a mystical contract between a king and the soil. The battles were fought in courtrooms and on the internet. She looked up at the statue of Cuchulainn in the GPO, a romanticized bronze of the hero in his death throes. The tourists walked past it, taking pictures, most of them unaware of the true story, of the goddess who had overseen his end. It was a monument to a story, not an invocation of a power. The Morrigan realized that her age was truly over, not just the age of gods, but the age where the concepts she embodied were central to the human experience. She was a ghost in the machine now, a fading signal in a world saturated with noise. The concrete world had its own sovereignty, and it had no need for a phantom queen. The unquiet earth. The feeling of irrelevance was a new and corrosive poison in the Morrigan's ancient veins. For eons, she had been a fundamental force, us integral to the world, us gravity or decay. Now she was a footnote, a superstition, a character in a video game. She retreated from the cities, from the frantic, soulless energy of modernity, and sought solace in the wild places that remained. But even here, the modern world had left its mark. The forests were managed, the bogs were drained, the mountains were scarred with hiking trails and litter. She found herself drawn to the most remote and desolate places, the wind-scoured peaks of the 12 Bens, the vast, silent expanse of the Bog of Allen, the storm-lashed cliffs of Slieve League. Here, the ancient song of the land was still audible, a faint, persistent hum beneath the silence. She would stand for days, motionless as the stone itself, trying to remember the feeling of a king's oath vibrating through the soil, or the thunder of a charge across Mug Turid.
It was during Salasa one of these vigils, on a nameless, heather-clad hillside in the west, that she felt a different kind of tremor. It was not the tremor of battle, nor of ceremony, nor of construction. It was a deep, groaning, psychic pain emanating from the land itself. It was a feeling of sickness, of violation on a cellular level. She followed the sensation, a thread of distress in the web of life. It led her to a place that looked, on the surface, unremarkable, a green field bordered by a small, sluggish stream. But the song here was wrong. It was discordant, sickly. The water in the stream had a chemical smell. The grass was a little too green, too uniform. The insects were few, and the birds did not nest here. This was a different kind of war, a silent war. A war not for the sovereignty of the land from a rival king, but against the land itself. It was being poisoned slowly and systematically by the byproducts of the concrete world, the fertilizers seeping from the fields, the plastics breaking down in the earth, the invisible, insidious chemicals that the modern world took for granted. A cold, fresh fury began to burn within the Morrigan. This was not the hot, glorious fury of the battlefield. This was a colder, deeper, more patient wrath. This was a violation of the most fundamental sovereignty, the right of the land to simply be. They were not just forgetting her, they were actively killing the very entity she was born to protect. She began to walk the island again, but with a new purpose. She was not seeking warriors or kings. She was diagnosing a sickness. She saw the dead zones in the rivers where fish could no longer live. She felt the weakness in the bees, their navigation confused by poisons. She saw the great, monstrous machines tearing into the flesh of the earth for peat and minerals, leaving behind raw, bleeding scars. This was a conflict that could not be won with a spear. The enemy was not an army with banners, but a way of life, a collective blindness, a paradigm of consumption and disposal. How does a goddess of prophecy and war fight against indifference? How does she rally an army against apathy?
She began to work in the only way she could. She became a spirit of unease. She was the sudden, gut-wrenching doubt that struck a corporate executive as he signed a permit for a new factory near a sacred site.
She was the nightmare that visited an engineer, dreams of the earth opening up and swallowing his creations. She was the stubborn, unshakable conviction in a farmer that his new, chemically treated fields were wrong, a feeling that drove him to seek out older, more sustainable methods. She sought out the sensitive ones, the modern-day druids and poets, not of verse, but of ecology and earth science. She was the flash of insight that led a biologist to discover a new pollutant. She was the fierce, protective anger that fueled an activist to chain herself to a tree slated for clearing. In these people, she found a new kind of champion. Their battles were fought with lawsuits and protests, with water samples and soil tests. But the spirit behind them, the fierce, defensive love for the land, was ancient. It was a spark of the old sovereignty. She stood at the edge of a clear-cut forest, the stumps of the great oaks like headstones. The devastation was immense. But as she looked, she saw a single, tenacious sapling pushing its way through the scarred earth, seeking the sun. It was a small thing, a fragile gesture, but it was an act of defiance. It was life insisting on its right to exist. The Morrigan, the Phantom Queen, the Great Queen, knelt, a gesture she had rarely made in all her long existence, and placed a hand on the soil beside the sapling. She did not pour her power into it. That was not the way of this new war. Instead, she acknowledged it. She bore witness to its struggle. The war had changed, the weapons had changed, but the cause remained. The land was under siege once more, and she, its most ancient and terrible guardian, had found a new reason to be. The fury was no longer for the glory of a hero or the destiny of a king, but for the right of that single sapling to grow. It was a quieter, more desperate battle, but in some ways it was the most important one she had ever fought. The endless cycle. Time, which had once flowed in great, mythic cycles for the Morrigan, now became a slow, patient river. The frantic pace of the 20th century gave way to the anxious, interconnected stasis of the 21st. She had adapted to her new role, no longer the orchestrator of epic destinies, but a subtle pressure in the fabric of the world, a guardian of the balance in an age of profound imbalance. She did not reside in any one place. She was the sigh in the wind that swept across the restored boglands, where the water was slowly clearing and the snipe were returning. She was the fierce joy in the heart of a community that had successfully fought off a mining corporation. She was the grim satisfaction when a polluting industry was finally held to account, a small, symbolic victory in the endless war. She had come to understand that her legacy was not a fixed story in a book, but a living, evolving principle. She was the inevitable resistance to stagnation and decay, which sometimes took the form of violent conflict and sometimes the form of a river cleansing itself. She was the terrible necessity of destruction that made way for new growth. The clear-cut forest was a tragedy, but it was also a blank slate. From the ashes of a forest fire, the first fire-adapted seeds would sprout. One evening, she found herself at the Hill of Uisneach, the mythological navel of Ireland, a place where all the provinces met. It was a place of immense, quiet power. A festival was underway, a modern gathering that mixed music, poetry, and a faint, earnest attempt to reconnect with the old ways. There were no blood sacrifices, no king-making ceremonies. There were families with children, teenagers with dyed hair, old men with thoughtful eyes, all gathered around bonfires. The Morrigan walked among them, unseen. She listened to a young woman with a guitar singing a song she had written about the plight of the salmon. The lyrics were modern, the melody folk-inspired, but the theme, the struggle of a sacred creature against man-made obstacles, was us, old us, the land itself. The goddess felt the girl's passion, her love for the land and its creatures, and she recognized it. It was a spark of the same fire that had once burned in the hearts of kings and heroes. She saw a group of people engaged in a quiet ritual, laying offerings of oats and honey at the base of the cat stone, an ancient glacial erratic. It was clumsy, perhaps, and based more on romantic guesswork than lost knowledge, but the intent was pure. It was an offering to the spirit of the place. It was an acknowledgement. She did not feel the need to correct them, to manifest and reveal the true way. The old ways were gone. These were the new ways. The form was different, but the essence, the desire to connect, to honor, to plead with the forces of the world was the same.
As the central bonfire blazed against the darkening sky, she stood at the edge of the crowd. The flames cast long, dancing shadows, and for a moment the centuries seemed to collapse. She could almost hear the echo of a druid's chant, see the ghost of a king accepting the cup of sovereignty. A child, a little girl who had strayed from her parents, looked directly at the spot where the Morrigan stood. Children, with their uncluttered perception, could sometimes sense what adults had learned to ignore. The girl didn't see a terrifying goddess of war. She saw a tall, sad-looking lady in the shadows. "Are you lost?" the little girl asked, her voice small in the vastness of the night. The Morrigan looked at her. The simple human concern in the question was disarming. She had been called many things: phantom, queen, crow, hag, sorceress. Never simply lost. "No, child," she replied, her voice a soft whisper that blended with the crackle of the fire. "I am waiting." "What for?" "For the wheel to turn, for the story to continue." The girl nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "My mom says the stories are important. They help us remember." A profound sense of peace, deeper than any she had known since the age of gods, settled over the Morrigan. "Your mom is very wise," she whispered. The girl's mother called her, and she skipped away, back into the light and the noise of the living. The Morrigan remained in the shadows. The festival would end. The people would go home. The modern world, with all its problems, would continue. But something had been reaffirmed. The land's song was still being sung, not in the old language of battle fury and kingly oaths, but in the new language of conservation, of art, of community, of a child's innocent question. She was not irrelevant. She was simply waiting for her aspects to be rediscovered, for her power to be called upon in new forms. The cycle was endless. There would always be a struggle. There would always be a need for sovereignty, for fury, for prophecy. She was the darkness that gave definition to the light, the struggle that gave meaning to the peace. Turning from the firelight, the Morrigan walked into the night, her form dissolving into the mist that rose from the cool grass. She was not gone. She was not forgotten. She was the memory in the stone, the resilience in the sapling, the fury in the activist, and the hope in the song. She was and would always be a part of the land.
The story was not over. It had simply begun a new chapter. The Whisper in the Code. The new chapter of existence was not written on vellum or sung by bards, but pulsed through fiber optic cables and flickered on screens. The Morrigan, ever the adapter, found the digital realm a strange and fascinating new frontier. It was a world of thought and image, a collective dream of humanity that was becoming us real, in its own way, us the physical world. And where humanity went, so too did its capacity for conflict. She learned to navigate this new landscape. She was not a user, but a presence. She was the glitch in a social media algorithm that accidentally connected activists across the globe. She was the sudden, viral spread of a damning piece of evidence against a corrupt corporation, a modern-day prophecy of their downfall. She was the corrosive, toxic fury that festered in anonymous comment sections, a new kind of battlefield where words were the weapons and souls were the territory. She observed how the ancient patterns repeated themselves in this digital agora. There were new tribes, not of blood or land, but of ideology and affiliation. They had their own chieftains, influencers, and thought leaders, and their own warriors who waged wars of information and reputation. They built walls around their beliefs as surely as the Uinil had built ring forts. The stakes were different, not life and death, but social capital and perceived truth, yet the underlying human drives for dominance, belonging, and defense were unchanged. One night, she found a nexus of particular intensity. A young man, a programmer named Kalen, was working deep in the underbelly of the internet, in encrypted channels and dark web forums. He was not a soldier, but he was a revolutionary. He was part of a dispersed, anonymous collective dedicated to exposing systemic injustices, a digital Fianna fighting a guerrilla war against what they sallallahu alaihi wasallam modern-day Fomorian giants, monolithic tech corporations, and surveillance states. Kalen was preparing to release a devastating data dump, a spear of code that would pierce the armor of a powerful entity. He was tired, paranoid, his mind a battleground of conviction and fear. He was, in that moment, a perfect vessel. The Morrigan did not appear to him as a woman or a crow. In this realm, she manifested as a pattern. She was a cascade of corrupted data that resolved on his secondary monitor into a single, stark, repeating symbol. A triple spiral, the ancient Triskelion. It was a symbol of motion, of cycles, of life, death, rebirth. Her symbol. Kalen stared at it, his heart hammering. It was just a glitch, he told himself, a coincidence, but it felt like a sign. It felt like an omen. The fear in his heart did not lessen, but it was joined by a cold, sharp clarity. It was the same clarity that had settled over Kukulin at the ford, the acceptance of a chosen path and its consequences. "This is it," he whispered to the empty room, his fingers hovering over the enter key. The point of no return. The Morrigan fed that clarity. She was the wind in his sails, the battle fury in his code. She was the whisper that said, "The story requires this. The cycle demands it." He pressed the key. The data was unleashed into the wild, a digital Gaia Bolg finding its mark. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The giant roared in pain and anger. News outlets, the modern bards, began to sing the tale. Kalen watched, a ghost in the machine, as his act of defiance rippled across the world. He was not a hero who would be lauded in a feasting hall. He was a fugitive. The battle was not won with a single blow. It simply entered a new, more complex phase of counterattacks, denials, and ideological skirmishes. It was messy, ambiguous, and utterly modern. The Morrigan watched him go to ground, his life forever changed. He had chosen his path, and he would live with the cost, just as all her champions had. The digital spear had been cast. The story had been advanced. The nature of the conflict had transformed. but the role of the goddess who inspires the defiant stand, who prophesies the fall of giants, remained constant. She had found a new ford to guard, and a new kind of hound to test. The memory of water. While part of her consciousness explored the digital ether, the core of the Morrigan remained bound to the physical land, to the soil and stone and water of Ire. The modern war for the environment was not fought only with protests and lawsuits, it was also fought with memory. The land remembered what it had been, and that memory was a potent, if silent, force. She was drawn to a valley in the Spearing Mountains, a place where a community was fighting not a corporation, but a government's plan to flood their valley for a reservoir.
It was a small story, unlikely to make international news, but it was a perfect microcosm of the eternal struggle. It was about a people's connection to their place, their Dinsenshas, the lore of place names that encoded history in the very landscape. The Morrigan walked the valley. She felt the deep time in the granite bones of the hills. She felt the more recent, but no less potent, memories of the families who had farmed here for generations. She stood in the small, whitewashed churchyard where their ancestors lay buried, the headstones speaking of lives woven into this specific patch of earth. To flood this valley was not just to displace people. It was to drown a story, to silence a verse in the long song of the land. She attended the community meetings, a silent listener in the back of the crowded hall. She felt their fear, their anger, their profound sense of powerlessness. They were not warriors or digital activists. They were teachers, farmers, shopkeepers, grandparents. Their enemy was not a monster they could slay, but a faceless bureaucracy wielding impact assessments and compulsory purchase orders. The Morrigan began to work. She did not summon crows or cause the earth to shake. Instead, she worked through the memory of the place itself. She was the sudden, overwhelming sense of belonging that struck a young planner from the government when he came to survey the land, a feeling so strong it made him question the ethics of his work. She was the dream that visited an elderly woman, a dream of her grandmother showing her the exact spot where the first potato was planted after the famine, a memory that galvanized the woman into becoming a fierce, unexpected leader of the resistance. She was the strange, persistent coincidence that kept bringing archaeologists to the valley, who then uncovered evidence of ancient settlements, ring forts, and a holy well dedicated to Brigid. Each discovery was another thread tying the valley to the deep past, making it harder to dismiss us merely a tract of land. It was becoming a place of documented significance, a place with a story that demanded to be heard. The final pivotal moment came during a public inquiry. A quiet, unassuming local historian was giving testimony. He was nervous, his notes trembling in his hands. He was speaking about the townland names, their meanings and origins. It was dry, academic stuff, and the officials were losing interest. Then, the Morrigan stood behind him. She did not touch him, but she poured the memory of the land into him. She gave him the words. His voice changed. It grew deeper, more resonant. He looked up from his notes, his eyes seeing not the stuffy inquiry room, but the valley itself. "This place is not just a location on a map," he said, his voice carrying a strange authority. "It is a living text. The stream there is called Ansrufan Fada, the long stream, because it remembers the path of a glacier. That hill is Knok Nangavar, the hill of the goats, because my great-great-grandfather grazed his flock there after being evicted during the plantation. To flood this valley is not progress. It is an act of cultural amnesia. It is to sever our connection to the very ground that holds the bones and stories of who we are. You are not just planning to drown a valley.
You are planning to drown a chapter of our collective soul." A profound silence filled the room. The bureaucrats, for a moment, were not looking at a nervous historian, but at the voice of the land itself, speaking through him. The Morrigan had given them a prophecy, not of blood, but of loss. A prophecy of a silence where a song should be. The inquiry was adjourned. The fight was not over, but the tide had turned. The land, through its people and its memory, had fought back. The Morrigan, the guardian of sovereignty, had once again defended the sacred contract between a people and their place. It was a quieter victory than Mag Tuired, but in the slow, patient war for the soul of the world, it was a battle won. The forge of a new age. The world, in its relentless turning, began to convulse. A different kind of storm was brewing, one not of armies or ideologies, but of the very elements. The Morrigan felt it first as a fever in the land, a rising, anxious hum in the song of the earth that was distinct from the localized poisonings of pollution. The climate, the great ballast breath of the world, was falling into a riastrad, a warp spasm of its own. She stood on the eroding cliffs of the wild Atlantic Way and felt the ocean's new, hungry fury. She walked through forests in the Midlands that were succumbing to blights and pests from foreign shores, brought by the shifting winds. She felt the deep, groaning stress in the bedrock as glaciers, ancient and patient, wept themselves into nothingness. This was a global battle, a war declared not by a queen or a nation, but by the consequences of a species' collective action.
The sovereignty under threat was that of the entire biosphere. The old methods felt insufficient. A single hero, a single community's defiance could not stand against this tide. The Morrigan, the strategist of conflict, understood that this war required a new kind of army and a new kind of weapon. The enemy was diffused, woven into the fabric of modern life itself. The counterattack had to be equally pervasive. She began to move through the world not as an inspirer of individuals, but as a synchronizer of efforts. She was the unseen link between a climate scientist in Norway modeling ice melt and an engineer in the Netherlands designing new seawalls. She was the sudden, shared insight between a permaculturist in Australia and a water harvesting activist in the Arizona desert. She was the global, distributed consciousness of resistance, the network of those who had heard the land's distress call and were heeding it. She found a new forge for champions, not in warrior schools, but in research laboratories, in policy institutes, in grassroots movements planting regenerative forests, and in the hearts of children leading school strikes for the climate. Their weapons were data, innovation, protest, and a fierce, protective love that transcended borders. They were the new Tuatha De Danann, a people of skill and knowledge, arriving not in clouds of mist, but through satellites and the internet, to fight a new form of Fomorian chaos, the chaos of a destabilized planet. One such champion was Ilara, a young woman leading a team developing a catalyst to break down ocean plastics. She was on the verge of a breakthrough, but was plagued by doubt and exhaustion, her spirit worn down by the sheer scale of the problem. In her lab late one night, staring at a graph that refused to resolve, she felt a presence, not threatening, but immense and ancient. It was the feeling of a mountain watching her. A memory, not her own, flashed in her mind. The image of Goibinyu the smith at his forge, not just hammering a sword, but pouring his intent, his very will, into the molten metal. The lesson was clear. The work was not just technical, it was spiritual. It required a fusion of knowledge and unwavering purpose.
A new clarity washed over Ilara. The problem on the screen was no longer an abstract puzzle. It was a dragon to be slain, a blight to be cleansed. She went back to her calculations with a renewed, almost savage focus.
The Morrigan had not given her the answer, but had reforged her will to find it. The breakthrough, when it came hours later, felt less like a discovery and more like a victory in a long, unseen war. This was the new battle of Mag Tuerid. It was fought on 1,000 fronts simultaneously. There were defeats, failed policies, devastating storms, species lost. But there were also victories, a protected wetland here, a city transitioning to renewable energy there, a new generation growing up with an innate understanding of ecological balance. The Morrigan did not preside over this conflict from a single outcrop. She was the connective tissue of the struggle itself. She was the grim satisfaction in the face of a farmer seeing his rewilded land teem with life again. She was the relentless pressure on the conscience of a CEO finally steering his corporation towards sustainability. She was the prophecy of a future that was still unwritten, a future where the fever of the world could break and a new, hard-won balance could be achieved. The war was vast, the enemy was complex, and the outcome was uncertain. But for the first time since the age of epic heroes, the Morrigan felt the stirrings of a conflict worthy of her full attention. The fate of the land, all land, hung in the balance, and she, the eternal queen of strife, would be there, weaving the fates of this new breed of hero until the very last battle was done.
The Crow at the World's End. The scope of the new war stretched the Morrigan's consciousness to its limits. She was no longer the goddess of a single emerald island, but a nerve in the global body of the earth, feeling every tremor of its sickness and every spark of its resilience. She witnessed the Great Barrier Reef bleaching, a ghostly prophecy in dying coral. She felt the Amazon burn, an agony that was a physical pain in her own being. She stood in the silent, expanding circles of Arctic ice melt, a desolation more profound than any battlefield. This was an apocalypse in slow motion, a Ragnarok without the dramatic clash of gods and giants, but with the same ultimate stakes. It demanded a perspective that transcended her ancient, parochial nature. To be only the Phantom Queen of Ireland was to be a general fighting for a single castle while the entire continent burned. She had to become something more. She began to seek out the other old ones, the numinous spirits of other lands, who were similarly awakening to the planetary crisis. She journeyed in ways that defied geography, her essence flowing along ley lines and dream paths. She met the jaguar spirit of the Amazon, a coiled power of shadow and tooth, who was enraged and grieving the murder of its jungle. She communed with the ancient, glacier-hearted spirits of the Himalayas, who were weeping their life away. She even encountered entities far older and stranger, the genii loci of deserts and abyssal trenches, all stirred from their aeonic slumber by the fever of the world. They did not speak in words, but in exchanges of essence, memories of pristine tundra, the taste of clean, cold air from a time before industry, the song of a whale in a silent ocean. It was a council of the wounded, a gathering of the dethroned. They were all, in their own ways, versions of her, sovereigns of their domains, now watching those domains be systematically dismantled. There was no unified front. Some, like the fiery, vengeful spirit of a volcano, advocated for a cleansing cataclysm, a purging of the human disease. Others had simply retreated into the deepest parts of their remaining sanctuaries, preparing to sleep through the end, their dreams becoming the last refuge of their world. The Morrigan, however, was a goddess of action, not of retreat or blind vengeance. She had seen the spark in Ilara, in Kaelen, in the farmers of the Sperrin Valley. She had felt the global network of resistance.
Humanity was the source of the blight, but it was also the only possible source of the cure. To unleash a planetary wrath would be to destroy the doctors along with the disease. She made her choice. She would not join the vengeful ones. Instead, she would become a conduit. She would carry the anguish of the jaguar spirit and translate it into a fierce protectiveness in the heart of an Amazonian activist. She would take the patient, deep-time wisdom of the mountain spirits and seed it into the mind of a geophysicist studying climate stabilization. She would be the global Bab, not just screaming over an Irish battlefield, but crying out in the dreams of every human who had the capacity to listen and act. She returned to Ireland, to the core of her power, but her perception was now irrevocably expanded. Looking out from the cliffs of Moher, she no longer saw Lalo Ale just the churning sea below. She saw Lalo the connected ocean, the circulatory system of a single suffering world. The song of the land was now a chorus, and it was a requiem mixed with a desperate fighting hymn. She was no longer just the Morrigan, she was becoming a part of the anima mundi, the world's soul, in its moment of greatest crisis. Her purpose was refined, sharpened to a terrible point. She would be the shadow that gave the light its meaning, the struggle that gave survival its value. She would haunt the halls of power and the quiet studies of scientists alike. She would be the crow at the world's end, cawing not just a lament for what was lost, but a challenge, a warning, and a call to arms for the entire human tribe. The final, greatest time was underway. The cattle raid was for the future itself. The final prophecy. The weight of the world's possible futures was a heavier burden than any crown of kingship. Having joined her consciousness to the anima mundi, the Morrigan now perceived reality not a single thread, but a shimmering, bifurcating web of probabilities. She saw Lalo not one destiny, but a spectrum of them, each a different answer to the question the age was screaming. She, the ultimate prophetess, was now the keeper of the ultimate, unwritten prophecy. She retreated to the most potent well of vision in her domain, not the one from her youth, but a place that had become sacred through cumulative suffering and hope, the pillar stone where Cuchulainn had fallen. The energy here was a complex tapestry of defiance, sacrifice, and endings, making it a perfect lens for scrying an end that was also a potential beginning. She placed her palms against the cold, rough granite. The stone, a recorder of deep time, hummed against her skin. She did not seek a vision in water or fire, but in the stone's own memory of cataclysm and regrowth. She opened her awareness to the web of fate. Visions, not as clear narratives, but as overlapping sensory impressions, flooded her. She sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the crimson thread, a future of cascading failure, the fever of the world breaking into a final lethal delirium. Cities, like the great Side mounds of old, were drowned and silent. The forests were ashes, the oceans acid and slime. The great migrations were not of people, but of desperate, starving animals fleeing nothing into nowhere. The songs that remained were dirges hummed by the last few humans huddled in the radioactive or sun-scorched ruins of their arrogance. In this fled, she felt the vengeful satisfaction of the volcano spirit and the final, cold sleep of the mountain gods. It was an end, clean, absolute, and devoid of hope. Then she sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the thread of iron, a future not of collapse but of grim, sterile survival. Humanity had conquered the crisis through brutal geoengineering and totalitarian control. The sky was hazed with reflective particles, the weather controlled by vast machines. Society was a hive, efficient and joyless, every life a cog in the great machine of species preservation. The land was managed, its wild song suppressed, its sovereignty utterly subsumed to the will of a terrified master race. It was a victory of a sort, but one that had sacrificed the very soul it sought to save. The land lived, but it did not sing. It hummed a monotonous, imprisoned tune. But there, faint and fragile as the first green shoot after a fire, was the thread of green gold. This was not a single future, but a branching path of countless small, resilient actions. She sallallahu alayhi wasallam rewilded cities where trees grew from skyscrapers and rivers ran clean through streets. She sallallahu alayhi wasallam a global network of communities living in dynamic, reciprocal balance with their bioregions, their technology mimicking the elegance of nature rather than seeking to dominate it. It was an end, clean, absolute, and devoid of hope.
The wars were not gone. Conflict was eternal, but they were fought over resources carefully managed and shared, not hoarded and plundered. It was a patchwork, messy, and imperfect world, but it was alive. It was a world where the memory of the old gods was not a superstition, but an understood metaphor for the sacred principles of a living earth. The song here was complex, a symphony of countless different melodies harmonizing in a whole greater than its parts. This was her final prophecy, not a prediction, but a map of possibilities. The crimson thread was the path of continued defiance of natural law. The thread of iron was the path of fear, control, and the death of spirit. The thread of green gold was the path of adaptation, humility, and integration. The choice was not hers to make. Her role was to see and to ensure that the choice was a conscious one. She was the weaver, but humanity now held the shuttle. She released her grip on the stone, the visions receding like a tide. The knowledge settled within her, a grim and awesome responsibility. She would not scream this prophecy from the rooftops. It was too vast, too complex for a single utterance. Instead, she would seed it. She would be the nagging doubt in the mind of an engineer designing a dangerous geoengineering solution, pushing him toward a safer path. She would be the burst of collaborative inspiration that leads a community to choose a regenerative model over an extractive one. She would be the fierce, protective love that makes a politician risk their career for a long-term environmental policy. Her prophecy was not a passive fortune to be read. It was an active field of battle. Every decision, from a nation's energy policy to an individual's choice to plant a tree, was a vote cast for one of these threads. The Morrigan, the queen of war and fate, had declared the ultimate war, a war for the future itself, to be fought not with spears, but with choices. And she would be on the front lines of every single one. The eternal return. With the map of potential futures etched into her being, the Morrigan's work entered its most patient and pervasive phase. She became a permanent, subtle pressure in the psyche of the world, a psychological and spiritual constant, us fundamental as gravity. The great, dramatic cycles of her early existence, the mating with the Dagda, the haunting of Cuchulainn, the curse upon a kingdom, were now complete. In their place was an eternal return, not of events, but of her essential nature, applying itself to the infinite, fleeting moments of the present. She understood now that she was not merely a Celtic goddess, she was an archetype, a fundamental force given a local name and form. Strife, sovereignty, and prophecy were universal constants. Her story was simply the Irish expression of a truth that existed everywhere, in every culture, in every conflict, in every struggle for balance. She sallallahu alaihi wasallam herself reflected in the world's other masks. She was the Hindu goddess Kali, dancing on the battlefield of existence, destroying the old to make way for the new. She was the Babylonian Ishtar, descending into the underworld, embodying both love and war, life and death. She was the Norse Valkyrie, choosing the slain, and the Greek Fates, cutting the thread of life. The names and stories changed, but the core principles, the necessity of destruction, the sacredness of the land, the inevitability of fate, were eternal. This realization did not diminish her, it universalized her. She was no longer just the Morrigan of Ireland. She was the Morrigan quality present in every instance of fierce protection, in every moment of transformative crisis, in every difficult truth that had to be faced. She watched a mother in a war-torn country fiercely defending her children, and she was there, the matcha aspect roaring to life. She observed a whistleblower preparing to reveal a devastating truth, and she was there, the badba aspect cawing a warning to the powerful. She felt the determination of a community rebuilding after a climate-fueled hurricane, and she was there, the sovereignty of the land aspect accepting their service and offering its resilience in return. Her battlefield was no longer a physical plane, but the entire theater of conscious action. A corporate boardroom where a CEO decided to prioritize sustainability over quarterly profits was a forge she guarded. A classroom where a teacher inspired a child to love the natural world was a kingship she tested. A scientist's lonely vigil over a dying glacier was a prophecy she shared. She became a season in the human soul. There was the spring of creativity and peace, the summer of growth and abundance, the autumn of harvest and decline, and then there was her season, the winter of conflict, the necessary struggle that tested resilience, cleared away the deadwood, and made the next spring possible.
To wish for a world without her was to wish for a world without winter, a stagnant, unproductive, then ultimately lifeless world. She did not demand worship, she demanded engagement. The old offerings of milk and butter at the hawthorn tree were an acknowledgement of this engagement. The modern acts of protest, innovation, and conservation were the same offering given in a new language. The form was irrelevant, the intent, the recognition of her power, and the desire to treat with it was everything. The Morrigan had achieved a state of being that was both active and eternally still. She was the wheel itself, not just a point upon it. She would forever be the catalyst, the challenge, the unblinking witness, and the final judge of what was worthy to endure. The stories of gods and heroes had been the practice, the childhood of her purpose. Now she was engaged in the adult, endless work of tending the balance of the world itself. Her journey had not ended, it had become the road. The Song in the Stone. All stories must find their rest not in an ending, but in a return to silence, where their echoes can live on. The Morrigan's epic, spanning the birth of consciousness to the edge of tomorrow, now drew towards its quietus. The frantic energy, the prophetic visions, the cosmic struggles began to recede from the forefront of her being, like a great tide pulling back from the shore. She had done her work. The seeds were planted, the warnings given, the fates woven. The choice now belonged to the world. She returned to the heart of her origin, to the essence of the land that had first given her form. She walked through the misty glens of County Sligo, along the wind-swept strands of the Dingle Peninsula, and through the quiet, haunted ruins of monastic settlements. She was not seeking anything anymore. She was simply being present, a final tour of the home to which she was eternally bound. She came to rest at last in the Bruna Boine, the great necropolis of her people. But she did not enter the great mound of Newgrange. Instead, she went to a smaller, forgotten satellite tomb, its entrance choked with grass and thyme. Here, in the absolute dark and silence, she sat. The sounds of the modern world, a distant plane, the hum of a power line, were faint, mere scratches on the surface of a deep, ancient quiet. One by one, she let go of her aspects. The bab, the battle crow, folded her wings and became silence. The matcha, the furious sovereign, let her rage cool into the patient resilience of the earth. The Morrigan, the phantom queen, allowed her form to dissolve. There was no longer a need for a shape, for a name, for a story. What remained was not a goddess, but a principle. She became a quality of the Irish landscape itself. She was the reason why a certain patch of mist on a bog seems to watch you as you pass. She was the faint, metallic taste of old blood on the air at a site of ancient battle. She was the defiant spirit in the gnarled hawthorn tree that refuses to be cut down. She was the sorrow in the rain and the fury in the winter storm. A group of tourists walked past the hill, their guide pointing out the features of the landscape. They took pictures and moved on, their minds already on the next stop, their next meal. They saw only a green hill under a gray sky. They did not see the goddess sitting in the dark beneath their feet. But one of them, a young woman, lingered for a moment after the group had moved on. She looked at the entrance to the small tomb, a mere depression in the grass, and felt a sudden, profound, and inexplicable sense of peace. It was the peace of an end story completed, of a watch faithfully kept. The Morrigan felt that moment of connection, this final, gentle touch from the world she was leaving to its own devices. It was enough. She did not die. A force of nature cannot die. She simply integrated. Her consciousness seeped back into the land, into the stone and the soil and the water. She became the memory in the granite, the resilience in the root, the prophecy in the spring. The great epic of the Morrigan was over. But on a lonely night, when the wind howls just so across the moors, you might hear a crow caw, a sound that is both a lament and a challenge. When you stand on a cliff edge and feel a sudden, fierce love for the land below, that is her. When you are faced with an impossible choice and find a core of iron will you never knew you possessed, that is her gift. The Morrigan is gone, but she is also everywhere. Her story is finished, but it is also just beginning. In every heart that chooses to fight for what it loves, to speak a difficult truth, or to honor the sacred sovereignty of the world. She is the song that has ended, and the silence that contains the potential for every song yet to be sung.